For almost all of human history, there were no cities, no kingdoms, no writing, and no records to tell us who we were. And yet, during that immense lost age, humans survived ice, drought, vanished coastlines, and worlds that no longer exist. They crossed lands now buried under the sea, lived beside other human species, and built ways of a life science still cannot fully reconstruct. So why does the most important chapter of our story remain the one we understand the least before we go deeper? Take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. Because tonight, we step into the prehistoric mystery science still can't explain. The strangest part of human history is not the age of pyramids, or emperors, or bronze blades lifted out of ruined cities. It is the age before all of that, the age that stretches behind civilization like a continent in darkness. For thousands upon thousands of generations, human beings walk the earth without kingdoms, without monuments, without written names, without archives, without any voice that reaches directly into the present. They leave behind broken stone, splinters of bone, hearth ash, butchered animal remains, footprints hardened in ancient mud, pigments pressed onto cave walls, beads pierced by careful hands, and the occasional burial that still carries a trace of feeling across impossible spans of time. But for the greatest portion of our story, the record is quiet where it should be loudest. It tells us that people are there, and that they endure, and that they change the world around them in ways both subtle and profound. Yet it does not fully explain what it was like to live through the immense prehistoric interval in which humanity becomes itself long before it builds anything we would casually call civilization. That silence is the mystery, not a silence of total absence, because evidence survives in astonishing quantities if one knows how to read it, but a silence of missing texture, missing continuity, missing explanation. The deeper one looks into prehistory, the clearer one fact becomes: modern humans do not suddenly appear as helpless creatures waiting for cities to teach them how to think. They survive brutal climates, cross hostile terrain, hunt dangerous prey, adapt to radically different ecosystems, care for children over long periods of dependency, manage social bonds in small groups, remember places across seasonal rounds, track migrations, recognize plants, work stone with exquisite control, and eventually produce symbols, ornaments, ritual behavior, and art. All of that happens before the first walls of the first cities rise from mud and dust. And yet the transition from ancient survival to civilization still seems, even now, strangely lopsided in the surviving record. It is as if we have inherited the last pages of a very long book, while the opening chapters were left in rain, fire, surf, and time. Imagine a world with no maps and no roads, where coastlines lie in different places, where rivers cut through plains that are now seabed, where grasslands spread across regions later buried by forest or desert, where entire human homelands will someday vanish beneath rising water. Imagine a child born into that world. Nothing about her life is simple, even if the material traces she leaves behind will appear simple to archaeologists tens of thousands of years later. She is born into knowledge she did not invent where flint can be found. When herds pass through a valley, how to watch the sky for weather, which roots nourish and which ones poison, how to carry embers, where danger waits in reeds at dusk, how to move when the wind turns cold. She learns gestures, habits, rhythms, warnings, obligations. She learns by watching older hands. She learns through repetition so old it has no author. In one sense, this is humanity before history. In another, It is humanity in one of its purest and most demanding forms, already sustained by memory, instruction, adaptation, and social intelligence, elaborate enough to keep fragile lives going in landscapes that forgive almost nothing. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. The prehistoric gap unsettles modern imagination because it offends our habit of measuring significance by visibility. We trust stone walls more than campfires, written records more than oral knowledge, fixed settlements more than mobile lives, civilization, because it builds upward and leaves dense debris behind, creates the illusion that history truly begins when people settle down long enough to be easily found. But that is a bias of preservation, not a fact about human importance. For the overwhelming majority of our existence, human beings live in worlds where intelligence must remain flexible, portable, and shared rather than monumental. Knowledge travels in bodies, not libraries. Skill is embedded in movement. Survival depends not on controlling a single place absolutely, but on understanding many places intimately. What survives in the record suggests lives of constant calibration to weather, to prey, to other groups, to scarce water, to fertile seasons, to the invisible boundaries of risk. Such lives can look thin in the archaeological record, but thin evidence does not mean thin experience. The numbers alone are disorienting. Written history occupies only a tiny fraction of the human past. Agriculture, permanent settlements, states, and cities are late arrivals. Anatomically, modern humans emerge far earlier, and their roots sink into even deeper human lineages stretching back through older species, older technologies, older experiments in survival. Scholars still debate many details of timing, behavior, and regional variation, but the broad picture is unmistakable. Human prehistory is not a short prelude. It is the main body of the story. Civilization, for all its power, occupies the narrow end of a far longer arc. And because of that, one of the greatest mysteries in science is not simply how civilization begins. It is what exactly happens during the immense span before it, and why so much of that formative age remains partially hidden. Part of the difficulty lies in the way time edits the world. Organic materials vanish: first wood, fibre, leather, basketry, hide clothing, cord, simple shelters, carved objects, plants gathered and prepared with care. The prehistoric people who master fire, clothing, binding, digging, trapping, and carrying may leave behind almost none of the tools that mattered most in daily life. Stone survives because stone is stubborn, and bone survives when conditions allow. But a stone point found in sediment is like a single word surviving from a lost language. It tells us something important, but not enough. It does not tell us the full social meaning of the hunt, the teaching that precedes the throw, the planning that precedes the migration, the fear carried through bad winters, or the stories repeated by firelight to preserve the memory of a place no one can afford to forget. The evidence remains incomplete not because prehistoric people lacked richness, but because rich lives are made of perishable things. There is also a deeper conceptual problem. We're trying to reconstruct minds from fragments. A handprint on a cave wall, a shell bead carried inland, red ochre rubbed into a burial, an arrangement of animal bones, a shaped point finer than necessity alone seems to require, all hint at inner worlds that cannot be fully excavated. At what point does symbol become identity? At what point does memory become tradition? At what point does practical skill shade into ritual, or ornament into status, or burial into belief? The boundaries are not always clear, and no single explanation fully accounts for the patchy appearance of complex behavior across different regions and periods. Some signs emerge early, then seem to disappear, then return elsewhere in stronger form. Some populations show remarkable ingenuity under pressure. Others leave simpler traces for long stretches of time. The old fantasy of a sudden switch flipping inside the human mind has become harder to defend. Prehistory increasingly looks less like a straight ascent and more like a flickering landscape of experiments, losses, innovations, bottlenecks, migrations, and reinventions. That is what makes the mystery so compelling. There may never have been a single missing key, no singular moment when humanity abruptly became modern in the way older narratives once preferred. Instead, there may be a long interval in which minds, much like our own, exist within social and ecological limits that either nourish complexity or suppress its visible expression. A small, scattered population can know a great deal and still leave little behind. A harsh climate can erase both people and their traces. A coastline rich in food and innovation can later drown, taking with it some of the most important evidence. A tradition can persist for millennia without writing, and then vanish with shocking speed when the chain of transmission breaks. Progress, in the prehistoric world, may not be cumulative in the comfortable modern sense. It may be local, fragile, reversible. The image many people carry of prehistory is still cluttered with outdated assumptions, brutish simplicity, endless sameness, slow minds in crude conditions waiting passively for the miracle of farming or cities. Yet the last decades of archaeology, paleoanthropology, genetics, and paleoclimate research have steadily worn that picture away. Early humans do not merely survive, they improvise, they spread, they specialize, they interbreed with other human groups. They adapt to coastlines, forests, open plains, cold margins, river corridors, and eventually to places so difficult that even modern observers struggle to imagine repeated habitation there. They alter ecosystems, contribute to extinctions in some regions, and develop social strategies whose full sophistication remains frustratingly difficult to measure. Even their absences are informative. A region empty of remains during one phase may reflect climatic collapse, migration, preservation failure, or patterns of land use that leave only faint signatures. The silence itself becomes data, though it remains dangerous data, easy to oversimplify and hard to interpret. And so the prehistoric mystery is not merely the question of what happened before civilization. It is the question of how much of humanity was already present before civilization ever began to record itself. Were language, myth, ranking, ritual obligation, deep ecological knowledge, long-distance exchange, an inherited memory already old when the first villages took root, did early humans rise repeatedly to forms of complexity that left too little durable evidence to satisfy modern standards? How many breakthroughs were lost? How many shorelines that once held camps, food processing sites, seasonal meeting grounds, or sacred places now lie beneath continental shelves under cold green water? How many inventions in clothing, containers, medicine, trapping, navigation, childcare, and social organization vanished because they were made of wood, sinew, leaves, skin, and voice? The deeper one goes, the stranger the scale becomes. Civilization begins to look less like the invention of humanity, and more like one late expression of capacities shaped in far older worlds. Cities do not create memory from nothing. Writing does not create thought. Monumental architecture does not create cooperation. Those things amplify and harden human abilities into durable forms, but the underlying faculties are forged over a far longer span, in camps and crossings and seasonal returns, under stars no one writes down, beside rivers that later move, in languages that leave no direct trace, among people whose names are lost but whose choices still echo in every later society. If that deep age remains difficult to explain, it is partly because it made us before it vanished. We are trying to study the workshop while living inside its final product. For now, the most honest starting point is to admit both how much has been learned and how much remains beyond reach. We know enough to abandon the old caricatures. We know enough to see prehistory as dynamic, inventive, and essential. We know enough to recognize that the missing expanse before civilization is not empty time. It is crowded time. Time full of movement, adaptation, fear, intelligence, intimacy, and repeated confrontation with environments powerful enough to shape the human body and mind alike. But we do not yet know how all those fragments fit together. We do not know why some sparks catch and others vanish. We do not know how many worlds have been erased. We do not know whether the greatest prehistoric breakthroughs occurred in places we've not found, or in materials that could not survive. We know the silence is real. We also know it is deceptive. Beyond that silence, the first contours of the lost world begin to emerge, a planet colder, harsher, and more unstable than the one most humans know today. A world in which ice itself becomes one of the great architects of human fate. Long before cities gather at riverbanks and long before fields are measured, taxed, divided, and inherited, the dominant force across much of the human world is not government or war or commerce, it is ice. Not simply ice in the ordinary sense of winter frost or mountain snow, but ice on a continental scale. Ice that advances and retreats like a slow planetary machine, locking up oceans, grinding rock to powder, diverting rivers, exposing land bridges, altering winds, and deciding where life can flourish and where it can barely persist. For prehistoric humans, climate is not a background detail. It is the architecture of existence. Every path they follow, every animal they hunt, every refuge they trust, every expansion or contraction of population unfolds inside a world repeatedly remade by cold. To picture that world properly requires unlearning the map of the present. Sea levels during glacial periods can sit dramatically lower than they do today, pulling coastlines outward and revealing immense plains that will later drown. Northern regions that are now forest, farmland, or city may stand under ice sheets of terrifying scale, while farther south broad belts of steppe and tundra stretch across continents in dry, windy openness. Dust rides the air, growing seasons shorten. Rain shifts course. In some regions the cold is direct and brutal, but in others the greater danger is aridity. A colder planet is often a drier one. Lakes shrink, vegetation reorganizes, animal herds follow changing corridors of pasture, whole regions open and close like gates over spans long by human reckoning but abrupt in geological terms. What appears stable for several generations can become unreliable within the memory of descendants. This is the stage on which much of human prehistory unfolds, and it is a stage defined by instability. The old image of the Ice Age as one long, uniform freeze has given way to something more dynamic and more unsettling. Glacial periods contain fluctuations within fluctuations, pulses of bitter cold, intervals of partial warming, dry phases, wetter episodes, regional contrasts, and sudden disruptions that no single community can control. Scholars still debate the precise effects of particular events in different regions, but the overall lesson is clear: prehistoric people are not adapting to one static environment. They are adapting to a moving target. Survival depends not merely on strength or cleverness in the moment, but on social systems capable of flexibility under recurring environmental stress. It is easy to underestimate how demanding that kind of world would be. A modern person can glance at a weather forecast and alter plans within minutes. Prehistoric humans do not possess that luxury. Their forecasts are embodied in experience, in the reading of animal movement, in cloud shape, in wind direction, in remembered cycles, in signals that only make sense if generations have watched the same landscapes closely and passed their observations on with enough fidelity to matter. A failed prediction is not an inconvenience. It can be hunger, injury, exposure, or death. In such conditions, knowledge becomes inseparable from survival. The location of shelter, the timing of migration, the route around dangerous ground, the memory of a spring that still flows late in a dry year, the recognition that a familiar valley has become less dependable than it was in childhood, all this matters as much as the sharpness of a spear point. And yet the glacial world is not only hostile, it is also productive in strange and uneven ways. Vast grasslands in colder, drier periods can support dense populations of large grazing animals. Mammoth, bison, horse, reindeer, and other species move through open country in patterns that skilled hunters can learn. River valleys and ecotones, where different environments meet, become especially valuable. So do seasonal bottlenecks where animal movement can be anticipated. In some places, cold landscapes support surprisingly rich human life, provided people know how to exploit them. The challenge is that abundance is rarely secure. Herds shift, winters worsen. One season's success can conceal the next season's risk. Human groups living in these worlds must balance mobility with familiarity, opportunism with caution. This is where the climatic story begins to feel less like backdrop and more like explanation. The deep prehistoric mystery is tied to the fact that humanity develops under repeated pressure from environments that punish rigidity. A species facing stable conditions might settle into narrow routines. A species confronting oscillation has to improvise. It must expand its diet when favored game declines. It must alter clothing, shelter, toolkits, and movement patterns. It must maintain social ties broad enough to provide mates, allies, and fallback options when one territory fails. It may need to remember places visited only rarely, preserving mental maps far larger than any one camp's immediate surroundings. Under such conditions, intelligence is not merely abstract problem-solving. It is ecological responsiveness distributed across a group. The physical traces of that responsiveness are often modest, but they are there. Stone tool traditions shift in form and emphasis. Hunting technologies become more specialized. Raw materials travel farther from their sources, suggesting wider movement or exchange. Hearths appear in places where controlled fire becomes essential to life. Occupation patterns expand into colder latitudes during favorable windows and contract when conditions deteriorate. The archaeological record rarely tells the full story in a neat sequence, but taken together it reveals repeated episodes of adjustment. What survives in the record suggests that humans are not simply enduring the Ice Age, they are learning from it, being shaped by it, and in some cases turning its constraints into opportunities. There is also a biological edge to this story. Human bodies are not separate from climate. Cold affects energy needs, mobility, reproduction, disease ecology, and the practical limits of where infants, elders, and injured individuals can be carried. Wind and exposure transform short journeys into dangerous undertakings. Clothing, though seldom preserved, becomes central. So does shelter. A prehistoric camp visible to archaeology as a scatter of stone and bone may once have included hides stretched with great care, insulated sleeping areas, storage arrangements, windbreaks, stitched garments, footwear, slings for children, and all the perishable ingenuity required to make a frozen world habitable. The evidence remains incomplete because the materials of survival were often the first to vanish. But the mere fact that people inhabit such environments at all implies technological and social competence far beyond what crude stereotypes once allowed. Then there is the psychological dimension, which archaeology can only approach indirectly. A glacial world is not just cold, it is immense. It is full of distance, uncertainty, and recurring thresholds beyond which a familiar landscape becomes dangerous or unknown. Seasonal darkness in high latitudes, screaming winds across open ground, frozen rivers, animal trails crossing white plains, sudden thaws that turn movement treacherous. All of this must shape perception and memory. People living in such worlds are likely alert to subtle cues modern observers barely notice. They may organize time less by calendar than by recurring environmental signs. They may define belonging through routes and refuges rather than fixed villages. The landscape itself becomes a kind of living archive, storing instruction in visible features and seasonal behavior. No single climatic story applies everywhere. Of course, Africa, Eurasia, Australia, and later the Americas all contain regional patterns of astonishing complexity. Some areas remain relatively buffered compared with the worst glacial extremes. Others are transformed repeatedly by alternating wet and dry phases rather than by direct encroachment of ice. In parts of Africa, for instance, the crucial issue may not be freezing cold so much as the shifting availability of water, grassland, and habitable corridors in Southwest Asia. Fluctuating conditions can alternately open and constrict pathways between continents. In Europe, advancing and retreating ice margins reshape opportunities for human occupation. In each case, climate does not determine behavior in a simple mechanical way, but it sets the terms within which choices become possible or impossible. This helps explain why the human story before civilization looks so uneven. Population does not spread smoothly. Innovation does not accumulate in a straight line. Regions are occupied, abandoned, reoccupied. Tool traditions persist for long periods in some places while changing rapidly in others. Some populations become isolated, others reconnect. A favourable climatic window may allow expansion into new territory, only for later deterioration to sever that connection and erase much of what had been achieved there. When archaeologists and paleoanthropologists find gaps in the record, they are often looking at the fingerprints of these disruptions. Sometimes people truly leave, sometimes their numbers collapse, sometimes the sediments that would have preserved their traces are stripped away. Sometimes the best places to live in one phase are now underwater or buried beneath later deposits. The silence deepens not because nothing happened, but because climatic turbulence makes the preservation of continuity unusually fragile. One of the most important and least intuitive consequences of the glacial world is that it expands geography while narrowing habitability. Lower sea levels expose huge tracts of land, linking regions now divided by water, yet much of the newly revealed terrain may be harsh, seasonal, or difficult to exploit consistently. In principle, humans gain roots. In practice, they must still survive them. The same cold that reveals a corridor can make it lethal. The same dryness that opens a grassland can strip it of dependable water. This tension between possibility and danger runs through prehistory. Landscapes invite movement, then punish it. Opportunities emerge, then vanish. Human groups that endure are those able to read the difference in time. There is a sobering implication here. Some of the apparent lateness of later developments may reflect not a lack of intelligence, but the tyranny of environmental volatility. It is difficult to build permanent, accumulating systems when the world repeatedly shifts underfoot. Agriculture, cities, and dense settlement require a degree of ecological predictability that long stretches of earlier prehistory often fail to provide. This does not mean cold climates prevent complexity altogether. Far from it. They may stimulate sophisticated knowledge and social coordination of their own kind, but they favour portable complexity, not yet the monumental kind. They reward movement, memory, and resilience more than permanence. And still, for all their hardship, these ice-shaped worlds do something profound. They train humanity in adaptation at scale. They push small populations across thresholds that would otherwise remain uncrossed. They create selective pressure for planning, cooperation, endurance, and social learning. They open bridges between continents and close them again. They foster both separation and contact. They generate regional refuges where people endure bad phases, then expand outward when conditions improve. In that sense, the world built by ice is not merely a prison, it is a crucible. Much of what humanity later becomes is forged not despite these unstable environments, but through them. When the ice loosens its grip, it does not simply leave behind empty ground. It leaves a human species already practiced in movement, already familiar with risk, already carrying memories of vanished routes and habitable margins. And some of those routes lead across lands that no longer exist, across broad, exposed plains and narrow corridors that will one day disappear so completely that their former presence seems almost mythical. Some of the most important journeys in human history take place across countries that have been erased, not conquered, not renamed, not buried beneath later cities, but physically removed from the visible world by the simple return of water. During colder phases of prehistory, when immense volumes of the planet's water are locked inside ice sheets and glaciers, sea level falls dramatically. Coastlines advance outward. Continental shelves become plains. Straits narrow or close. Estuaries turn into river valleys. What is ocean now can become grassland, marsh, dune field, or broad low country crossed by animals and people alike. These lost lands do not survive in familiar memory, because they vanish before written history begins. Yet for long spans of time they are not margins at all. They are habitable ground, migration space, hunting territory, and perhaps in some cases some of the richest human environments on Earth. This changes the map of prehistory in ways that are still difficult to absorb. It means that the world our ancestors moved through is not the world we inherit. The shorelines modern people treat as permanent are only temporary edges in a longer rhythm of exposure and drowning. A camp once set beside a river mouth may now lie far offshore. A route followed for generations may end beneath a cold shelf sea. An inland hunting plain may become a fishing ground, and then disappear altogether under rising post-glacial water. The evidence for these vanished landscapes survives only in fragment submerged topography, offshore sediment cores, drowned river channels, occasional artifacts dragged from the seabed, and the logic of paleoclimate and sea level reconstruction. The rest must be inferred carefully. Scholars still debate the scale of particular human occupations in some of these places, but no serious account of prehistory can ignore them. Too much land is missing. One of the clearest examples lies between Britain and mainland Europe. Today the North Sea seems permanent, a barrier, a weathered expanse separating island from continent. But during lower sea levels, much of that basin is dry land, a vast region of plains, wetlands, rivers, and low hills often referred to as Doggerland. For prehistoric people, this is not a remote curiosity. It is a real landscape, one through which game moves and humans move with it. Archaeological material recovered from the North Sea floor, along with paleo-environmental data, suggests a world of remarkable ecological richness, at different times marshes full of bird life, waterways dense with fish, open ground grazed by large animals, wooded patches developing as climates warm. It is exactly the sort of place mobile hunter-gatherers might know intimately. But when post-glacial seas rise, that country shrinks, fragments, and finally disappears. Whatever camps, meeting places, habitual routes, or sacred locations once existed, they are largely beyond normal excavation, taken by a sea that preserves poorly and reveals reluctantly. Farther east and north, the broad exposed shelves of Ice Age Eurasia create other lost corridors. Land bridges connect regions later divided by water, though each route has its own ecological logic and its own dangers. The most famous of these is Beringia, the enormous area linking Northeast Asia and northwestern North America during periods of low sea level. Popular imagination often reduces it to a narrow bridge, as if people simply walked across a strip of exposed mud and entered a new world. In reality, it is, at times, a massive region in its own right, ecologically complex and climatically variable. For some populations, it may have been not merely a passage but a homeland or prolonged staging area. Human movement into the Americas, one of the defining migrations of prehistory, is tied to this shifting zone of exposure, opportunity, and constraint. Yet even here the story resists simplification. Dates, routes, and tempo remain debated. Coastal dispersal may have mattered alongside inland pathways. Some evidence remains frustratingly sparse. No single explanation fully accounts for every pattern emerging from archaeology, genetics, and paleo-environments. What does seem certain is that people crossed into landscapes no written memory would ever name, using geographies that later disappeared from sight. To move through such worlds requires more than bravery. It requires a sophisticated understanding of terrain that is itself unstable over long spans. Rivers change course across exposed shelves, marshes form and dry. Herds alter migration routes with shifting vegetation. Fresh water may be plentiful in one season and scarce in another. A group making its living in these places cannot rely on permanence in the settled agricultural sense. It relies instead on recurring knowledge where to find fish when estuaries run full, where animals bottleneck, where higher ground offers safety in floods, where wood can be gathered, where the sea in its distant line still provides resources without yet swallowing the land. The people who live there are not wandering randomly over empty space. They are inhabiting an environment dense with practical meaning. This matters because one of the persistent distortions in thinking about prehistory is the tendency to associate mobility with ignorance. The opposite is often closer to the truth. A mobile people may need a broader map in the mind than a sedentary one. It must know not one field, but many valleys, many seasons, many fallback routes, many signs of abundance and warning. On drowned landscapes, this kind of knowledge may be especially important, because the richest zones often lie where land and water interact. Wetlands, estuaries, tidal flats, and river mouths can supply fish, birds, plants, shellfish, mammals, and freshwater access in astonishing concentration. Such environments reward careful observation and repeated return. They can support dense patterns of use without leaving behind the durable architecture later archaeologists find easiest to recognize. When those landscapes drown, the traces become doubly elusive. The result is a cruel paradox. Some of the most attractive prehistoric habitats may now be among the least accessible to science. There are hints of this problem all across the world. The shelf between mainland Southeast Asia and the islands of western Indonesia, often referred to as Sunderland when exposed during lower sea levels, once forms a vast subcontinental extension of habitable land. River systems run across areas now underwater. Human and animal populations move through a geography profoundly different from the one seen on modern maps. To the south and east, the routes towards Sahul, the Ice Age landmass combining Australia and New Guinea, involve crossings whose exact timing and character remain some of the great achievements of early human dispersal. Even at lower sea levels, some sea travel is still required. That implies planning, watercraft of some kind, group coordination, and confidence in reaching land not always visible from the point of departure. The evidence remains incomplete, but what survives in the record suggests that humans reach Australia astonishingly early. That fact alone should unsettle any lingering image of passive, narrow, or purely local prehistoric populations. They are already capable of movements that demand foresight and adaptation beyond simple opportunism. The same broad principle applies in many other regions. The Persian Gulf basin during lower sea levels may have contained habitable zones later inundated. Shelf areas around the Mediterranean, Black Sea margins, parts of the Indian Ocean rim, and coastlines now deeply transformed by Holocene rise all conceal possible chapters of human occupation. In some places the seabed yields stone tools, faunal remains, or drowned landforms that hint at former habitation. In others, the case is more inferential, built from the known attractiveness of these environments and the sheer amount of territory lost. Caution is necessary here. Not every exposed shelf was densely peopled, and underwater archaeology is technically difficult, expensive, and often inconclusive. Yet the broader conclusion remains unavoidable. Much of the stage on which prehistoric migrations unfold has been physically removed from ordinary archaeological view. This has consequences for how we interpret the spread of ideas as well as populations. A route is never just a line on a map. It is a channel through which techniques, genes, stories, symbolic habits, exchange networks, and social contacts may travel. If major corridors now lie underwater, then some apparent discontinuities in the record may be products of missing geography rather than genuine isolation. Groups that seem far apart on the modern map may once have been linked by coastal or lowland chains now destroyed. Innovations that appear to emerge suddenly in one excavated region may have older histories elsewhere along drowned routes. The prehistoric world begins to look less like a few scattered inland dots, and more like a fluid network with whole central segments missing. There is also something emotionally disquieting about these lost lands. It is one thing to imagine ruins hidden in jungle or buried under desert. It is another to accept that entire human countries, in the deepest sense of the word, are gone without visible memorial. Places where children are born, where people bury their dead, where they learn familiar bends in rivers and return to seasonal abundance, where paths become traditions simply through repeated use. All can vanish underwater so completely that later ages never know they existed. No inscription marks their loss. No chronicler laments the drowning in words we can read. The only witnesses are sediment, shoreline retreat, and the stubborn recurrence of human remains and artifacts in places where modern geography says no one should have lived. The silence returns, but now it has a shape. It is the shape of a coastline receding inland year after year until memory itself is cut off. Such drownings are not always gradual in human terms, either. Post-glacial sea level rise unfolds over millennia, but its local effects can come in pulses, and in low-lying terrain even modest changes can transform habitability with shocking consequences. Wetlands become open water, freshwater sources turn brackish, familiar routes are broken, productive ecotones shift landward, populations must retreat, adapt, or reorganize. Some archaeologists have wondered whether the memory of advancing seas may echo very faintly in later flood traditions, though direct links are difficult to prove and should be treated cautiously. Still, the intuition is understandable. A people watching ancestral ground diminish generation after generation would not easily forget the lesson, even if the words used to carry that memory changed beyond recognition. The great migrations of prehistory, then, are not simply heroic marches across visible continents. They are movements through temporary worlds. Humans expand across plains that are now seabeds, through corridors opened by ice and later closed by climate, along coasts whose ancient harbours lie submerged far from shore. They follow game into lands that will vanish, and perhaps establish lifeways in environments that later science can scarcely sample. This is one reason the prehistoric record feels so haunted by incompleteness. We're not only missing documents, we are missing terrain. We're trying to trace the paths of people whose roads were drowned and whose most important waypoints may lie under meters of water and sediment. And as these migrations unfold, something else becomes increasingly difficult to ignore. Humanity does not simply spread. It begins, in scattered flashes, to reveal signs of a mind working in new registers, making marks, shaping symbols, carrying beauty, and producing forms of ingenuity that appear unevenly, almost mysteriously, across the prehistoric world. For a very long time, early humans are judged by what survives most easily in the groundstone flakes, points, scrapers, butchered bones, hearth residues, occasional shelters, and the hard evidence of practical life under pressure. Then, in scattered places and at different times, the record begins to reveal something else. It reveals choices that seem to exceed immediate survival. Pigment is collected, carried, and used. Shells are pierced and worn far from the coast. Bones and antler are shaped with unusual care. Geometric marks appear on surfaces. Burials become more deliberate. Cave walls receive images that require planning, memory, and control of space. None of these things emerges everywhere at once, and none follows a simple upward line. That is precisely what makes the pattern so difficult to explain. The puzzle is not whether prehistoric humans are intelligent. By this point, that is beyond serious doubt. The puzzle is why certain forms of symbolic and technical complexity flare into visibility unevenly, flickering across time and region like distant fires in a dark landscape. Older narratives liked clean thresholds. They imagined a single great awakening, a sudden revolution in cognition, when fully modern humans supposedly crossed a decisive mental boundary and began thinking like us. There was comfort in that idea because it reduced deep prehistory to a clear before and after. Before practical but limited, after symbolic, inventive, recognizably human in the fullest sense. But the evidence has become harder to force into that shape. Signs of symbolic behavior appear earlier than once believed in some places, yet not always continuously. sophisticated technologies coexist with periods that seem more conservative. Ornament, pigment use, and abstract marking sometimes appear in fragmentary or localized ways before later blossoming more visibly. Scholars still debate what exactly counts as symbolism in some cases, and they debate whether demographic change, social density, environmental stress, or cognition itself best explains the pattern. What no single explanation fully accounts for is the stop-start character of the evidence. Take pigment, especially red ochre. In itself it is only coloured earth, iron-rich and visually striking. Yet when prehistoric people seek it out, transport it, grind it, mix it, and apply it to bodies, objects, surfaces, or perhaps the dead, it begins to suggest a world in which appearance matters beyond pure utility. Ochre may preserve hides, serve in adhesives, mark identity, express ritual, or perform several functions at once. The problem is not that archaeologists cannot imagine uses. The problem is that use multiplies meaning rather than narrowing it. A piece of ochre with grinding facets is a clue, but it does not announce whether it belonged to adornment, ceremony, practical chemistry, or all three combined. Still, the repeated recurrence of pigments in widely separated prehistoric contexts tells us something important. Human beings are not merely responding to the material world as a set of problems to solve. They are also selecting, marking, transforming, and perhaps investing parts of that world with social significance. Shell beads create a similar difficulty. A pierced shell found far inland is not just an object. It is evidence of movement, exchange, choice, and display. It may travel from coast to interior through direct movement or through chains of contact between groups. It may be worn to signal belonging, age, kinship, status, mourning, beauty, or some social code now inaccessible. What matters most is that it is not necessary in the narrow sense. A shell worn against the body contributes little to warmth or caloric gain. Its value lies elsewhere, in communication or meaning. And once such objects appear, they imply audiences. Ornament assumes other eyes. It assumes a social field in which visible distinctions are legible to those around you. This is one reason seemingly small finds can feel so momentous. A bead no bigger than a fingernail can imply a whole missing world of convention. Then there are marks that seem to preserve intention without depicting anything obvious. Engraved lines, repeated patterns, cross-hatching, deliberate notches, abstract motifs on ochre, bone, stone, or cave surfaces. These are among the most tantalizing traces in prehistory because they seem to sit near the threshold between decoration, notation, and symbol. Some may be simple byproducts of working a material. Others look too regular, too patterned, too deliberate to dismiss. Yet interpretation remains treacherous. The human mind is eager to find meaning in patterns, and archaeologists must be careful not to overread. Still, it is difficult to ignore the cumulative force of these markings. They suggest that in some communities, at some moments, visual pattern itself has become worth preserving or repeating, whether that means counting, memory aid, identity marking, ritual convention, or purely aesthetic order remains uncertain. The evidence remains incomplete. But incompleteness is not absence. Perhaps the most famous of all prehistoric symbolic traces is cave art. Though even that phrase can mislead, it encourages modern habits of appreciation, as if these images are made simply to be looked at in the way a gallery invites viewing. In reality, many decorated caves are difficult to access, deep, dark, and acoustically strange. The paintings and engravings are often placed in locations that require effort, light, planning, and familiarity with underground space. Animals appear with remarkable vitality: bison, horses, aurochs, deer, mammoths, lions, rhinoceroses. Hands are stenciled or painted. Signs of uncertain meaning accompany figurative forms. Surfaces are used with awareness of contour and shadow. Whatever these spaces are for, they are not accidental. They imply preparation, memory, and repeated practice. They also imply shared codes, because an image in darkness only matters socially if others understand, or are meant to understand, why it is there. Yet even here the pattern is uneven. Some of the most celebrated cave art belongs to relatively late Upper Paleolithic contexts in Europe, which once encouraged a Europe-centered story about the flowering of symbolic humanity. But discoveries elsewhere, including early engravings, pigments, ornaments, and possible symbolic objects in Africa and other regions, complicate that story profoundly. Symbolic behavior is not a single European miracle, nor is it a neat package that arrives whole and never retreats. Different regions reveal different rhythms, and preservation biases distort all comparison. Cave art survives where caves preserve it. Perishable art on wood, bark, skin, woven material, or open-air surfaces usually does not. A painted cave wall can dazzle the modern eye into thinking symbolism begins where it is preserved best. In truth, far older or equally rich traditions may have vanished without a trace. This is where the puzzle of sudden ingenuity becomes more subtle. The ingenuity is not really sudden in the sense of appearing from nothing. Rather, it becomes archaeologically visible in bursts. One reason may be demographic. Small, scattered populations can lose skills easily. If knowledge depends on a limited number of skilled individuals and fragile lines of transmission, then downturns in population, migration, or ecological stress can break the chain. Innovations may arise, fade, reappear, or spread only when enough people are connected to sustain them. Some researchers argue that larger or more interconnected populations preserve complexity better, because ideas are less likely to die with their holders. This is plausible, but it does not explain everything. Some innovations occur in populations that are not obviously large, and not every dense population automatically generates symbolic elaboration. Environment may also matter. Periods of relative stability could allow more social display, ritual elaboration, and experimentation with non-essential forms. Times of stress, on the other hand, might redirect effort toward immediate survival. But this explanation too has limits. Harsh conditions can also intensify social signaling, cooperation, and the need for symbolic cohesion. A group under pressure may depend even more on ritual, shared identity, and encoded knowledge. No single environmental rule predicts exactly when art, ornament, or abstract marking will appear. Sometimes pressure suppresses visible elaboration. Sometimes it seems to sharpen it. There is also the possibility that the modern category of symbolic behavior is itself too blunt. The minds producing fine tools, coordinating hunts, navigating large territories, caring for vulnerable group members, and transmitting survival skills over generations are already operating with astonishing complexity. Symbolism may not be a late add-on so much as a deep human capacity that only occasionally leaves durable traces. Storytelling, dance, body painting, song, gesture, naming systems, teaching rituals, seasonal ceremonies, and sacred geographies could all structure prehistoric life while leaving little or nothing that archaeology can recover. In that case, The apparent emergence of symbolism would partly reflect preservation bias. What looks like a mental threshold may really be a threshold of visibility. Still, some developments do seem to indicate genuine shifts in intensity or social role. Composite tools require planning across materials. Personal adornment suggests increasingly explicit signalling. Long-distance transport of valued materials hints at social networks extending beyond immediate subsistence. Burials with care or grave goods point toward concepts of personhood and obligation, not reducible to disposal of bodies. The famous interments of some Paleolithic individuals, though interpreted cautiously, continue to raise the possibility that the dead are being treated in ways shaped by memory, affection, rank, or belief. A burial is never just a technical act. It is a social one, and sometimes a cosmological one, even when the cosmology cannot be reconstructed. The deeper mystery, then, is not whether prehistoric humans become ingenious. They are ingenious from the beginning in any practical sense that matters. The mystery is why ingenuity becomes visible in some forms, places, and periods more strongly than in others, and why it so often appears to come in pulses. Perhaps cultural life in deep prehistory is less like a ladder and more like weather, with fronts, eddies, build-ups, and dispersals. Perhaps many human groups carry capacities similar in principle, but only certain combinations of population density, ecological opportunity, social competition, memory, and material preservation allow those capacities to leave the kinds of traces modern science recognizes. What can be said with confidence is that by the time these signs appear, even in fragmentary form, the old image of prehistoric life as mentally dim or culturally flat is no longer tenable. A pierced shell, a deliberate engraving, a body stained with pigment, a hidden panel of animals painted in flickering light, each is small on its own. Together they suggest minds living in worlds layered not just with hunger and danger, but with significance. And those worlds are not inhabited by our ancestors alone. In several regions, other humans walk beside them, close enough to meet, compete, learn, and even join their bloodlines before fading into history's deepest shadow. For much of modern history, people like to imagine the human past as a lonely ascent. There were primitive ancestors behind us, perhaps, but only one true humanity moving steadily forward, as if the road to the present had always been reserved for a single kind of being. That picture has collapsed. The deeper prehistory becomes, the more crowded it looks. Anatomically, modern humans are not alone in the old world. They share it with other humans, close relatives shaped by parallel histories, adapted to different conditions, carrying their own traditions, technologies, and ways of surviving. Some are known from skulls and skeletons. Others enter the story first through genetics, as if science hears their echo in living bodies before it sees their faces clearly in the earth. The result is one of the most haunting realizations in all prehistory. Our ancestors do not simply emerge into an empty stage. They enter a world already inhabited by others who are human enough to resemble us, different enough to unsettle us, and near enough to leave traces inside us. The best known of these relatives are the Neanderthals, whose fate has long been distorted by caricature. For generations they are cast as brutish, dim, and doomed, creatures of cold caves and blunt violence waiting to be replaced by something finer. The evidence no longer supports that simple story. Neanderthals live across large parts of Western Eurasia for an immense span of time. They endure repeated climatic swings, occupy difficult environments, hunt large animals at close range, care for the injured, make tools with skill, control fire, and very likely possess social lives far richer than earlier stereotypes allowed. Their bodies are distinctive, powerful and compact, shaped in part by the demands of Ice Age existence. Their faces, reconstructed from bone, appear both familiar and profoundly other. They are not failed humans. They are another successful human form. Their success makes their disappearance more mysterious, not less. If Neanderthals endure harsh glacial worlds for hundreds of thousands of years, why do they vanish? The question has tempted simplistic answers for a very long time. Perhaps modern humans are simply smarter. Perhaps they are more violent. Perhaps climate alone destroys Neanderthal populations. Perhaps disease plays the decisive role. Perhaps competition is direct and ruthless. Yet the evidence resists any single clean explanation. By the time modern humans expand into regions occupied by Neanderthals, the conditions are already complicated. Climate fluctuates, habitats shift, large game populations rise and fall, human groups, likely sparse in many places, move through fragmented and changing landscapes. There may be coexistence in some regions, replacement in others, limited exchange in one area and avoidance in another. Scholars still debate the exact tempo and geography of the overlap, and they debate whether the decisive factor is demographic pressure, broader social networks among Homo sapiens, technological differences, ecological flexibility, interbreeding, or sheer bad luck at population margins. No single explanation fully accounts for the pattern. Interbreeding matters because it destroys the old myth of absolute separation. Neanderthals are not merely replaced, they are also absorbed in part. Genetic evidence shows that many living humans outside Africa carry Neanderthal ancestry, a faint inheritance from encounters deep in prehistory. That discovery changes the emotional and scientific shape of the story. It means these worlds do not only collide, they also touch intimately. Somewhere in Ice Age Eurasia, people who would once have seemed separate in schoolbook diagrams meet closely enough to have children. The descendants of those unions survive, spread, and eventually help populate much of the globe. The vanished relative is not entirely gone. A fragment remains, diluted through generations but still present. Extinction, in this case, is not pure disappearance. It is part erasure, part merging, part transformation into ancestry. If Neanderthals complicate the Western Eurasian picture, Denisovans make the whole prehistoric world stranger still. They are first recognized not from a complete skeleton or a famous cave full of dramatic finds, but from genetic material recovered from fragmentary remains in Siberia, a finger bone, teeth, a few elusive pieces, and suddenly science realizes that another human population, or perhaps a network of related populations, once existed across parts of Asia. Their physical appearance remains frustratingly obscure compared with Neanderthals. Their range and diversity are still being revised as new evidence emerges, but their genetic legacy is unmistakable. Populations in parts of Asia and Oceania preserve Denisovan ancestry, in some cases in significant proportions, indicating ancient contact between Homo sapiens and these ghost-like relatives. Some inherited genes may even have aided adaptation to specific environments, including high altitude in certain populations. The image is extraordinary. An entire human branch enters modern awareness almost as a whisper in DNA before archaeology can fully sketch its body or culture. And Neanderthals and Denisovans may not exhaust the cast. The deeper researchers look, especially in Africa and Asia, the more likely it seems that human evolution includes populations and lineages not yet neatly named or fully known. Fossils can be sparse, fragmentary, hard to date, or difficult to fit into clear categories. Genetic signals sometimes hint at archaic admixture from groups for which there is little or no secure skeletal record. Africa in particular, vast and environmentally diverse, may have hosted multiple interacting populations of early Homo sapiens and related groups whose relationships are more braided than linear. What survives in the record suggests not a tidy family tree but something closer to a shifting river system, with channels splitting, rejoining, and drying out over immense spans of time. The human story before civilization is not just long, it is populous. This raises difficult questions about behavior and contact. What does it mean for different humans to share a landscape? They may compete for prey, shelter, raw materials, and seasonal range. They may avoid each other where possible. They may observe each other from a distance for generations, building patterns of caution or imitation. They may exchange techniques indirectly. They may fight. They may also recognize one another as possible mates under some circumstances, especially where populations are small and territories overlap. The archaeological record can rarely resolve such encounters in detail. It preserves tools, bones, sometimes camps, almost never conversations or intentions. But the possibility of recurring contact is enough to unsettle any simple picture of prehistory as a sequence of isolated species taking turns on the same stage. There is a temptation to imagine a dramatic final confrontation, a singular contest in which one human type defeats another. It is a powerful image, but reality is probably slower, patchier, and more tragic. Small populations can disappear without grand battles. A slight demographic disadvantage, repeated across generations, can be enough. If one group maintains broader exchange networks, it may recover from local setbacks more effectively. If climate fragments habitats into refuges, already sparse populations may become vulnerable to inbreeding, accident, disease, or the loss of local resources. If modern humans possess somewhat more flexible diet strategies, faster innovation spread, or larger alliance structures, those advantages may matter not in one decisive moment but across hundreds or thousands of years. The end of a human relative may come less like a dramatic overthrow than like a diminishing signal. Weaker in one valley, absent in the next, then gone except for genes carried forward in another people's descendants. The emotional force of this story lies partly in how close these others are. Neanderthals bury some of their dead, though the exact meaning of particular burials remains debated. They care for injured individuals long enough to suggest social support. They use pigments in some contexts. They produce tools fitted to demanding environments. Their lives are not animal in any simple dismissive sense, nor are they merely lesser versions of ours. Denisovans, though harder to picture, are close enough to leave living traces within our biology. Even older or more obscure relatives likely share capacities we only dimly understand. The boundary between us and them becomes historically unstable. The more evidence accumulates, the harder it is to defend the comforting fiction that humanity was always singular, obvious, and isolated. This has profound consequences for the prehistoric mystery. If multiple human groups coexist and sometimes interact, then cultural change may arise not only from internal invention, but also from contact zones. A new tool form, a movement strategy, a territorial shift, or even a symbolic habit may spread through networks we can barely reconstruct. Likewise, disappearance may involve assimilation as much as replacement. Some traditions may vanish because the people who carried them vanish. Others may survive in altered form inside populations that absorb outsiders. The record becomes more layered and more difficult to read. A stone tool tradition may reflect local continuity, outside influence, convergent adaptation, or some mix of all three. A genetic signal may outlive the people whose bones are gone. A burial may belong to a being whose closest descendants are not extinct, only renamed by time. There is also a philosophical discomfort here that scholars sometimes keep at arm's length but never fully escape. If other humans existed beside our ancestors and disappeared, then our own survival begins to feel less inevitable than later civilizations like to assume. We are not the obvious endpoint of a ladder. We are one surviving branch from a wider human thicket. Had conditions shifted slightly differently, another branch might have endured longer, mingled more deeply, or shaped the later world in ways now impossible to imagine. The triumphal story of human progress begins to fray. Survival is still impressive, but it is also contingent. And yet the disappearance of these relatives does not leave the earth suddenly simple. It leaves a legacy of absence. Modern humans continue onward carrying traces of others within their genes, and perhaps within habits no archaeologist can isolate. They inherit landscapes already used, routes already known, and ecological lessons already tested by different hands. When the last Neanderthals fade from Europe and Denisovan populations recede into the shadows of Asia's deep past, something irreversible has happened. Humanity has become narrower even as Homo sapiens expands wider. One kind of crowding ends, and a new loneliness begins. But even within our own species, the story remains painfully incomplete. If several human worlds can vanish with only fragments left behind, then the next problem becomes unavoidable. How much of ordinary prehistoric life has disappeared in the same way? Not because the people vanished entirely, but because the earth kept almost nothing of what mattered most to them. If prehistory often feels like a broken narrative, that is not only because it is old, it is because the earth is selective and often ruthless in what it agrees to keep. Most human life is made of things that do not last. Wood rots, fibre frays, leather decays, plant food vanishes, shelters collapse back into soil, paths disappear after a few seasons, spoken knowledge, unless tied to durable repetition, dies with its last living bearer. Even bones, which seem so solid when lifted into museum light, can dissolve under the wrong conditions long before anyone is there to find them. The archaeological record is not a neutral archive waiting patiently beneath our feet. It is a damaged remainder, a survival of accidents. What we call evidence is only the fraction of life that escapes fire, water, scavengers, acidity, erosion, pressure, chemical dissolution, later construction, and the sheer indifference of time. This matters more than it first appears, because it means whole categories of prehistoric achievement may be undercounted almost beyond recovery. A carefully shaped stone point can survive for tens of thousands of years. The wooden shaft it was fixed to almost never does. A scraper may endure. The hide garments produced with it vanish. A bone needle occasionally survives, but the tailored clothing, bags, wrappings, and slings it once made possible are gone. Charred seeds might remain in a hearth, yet the wider knowledge of plant gathering, storage, medicinal use, seasonal timing, and preparation techniques is reduced to scattered hints. The result is a powerful distortion. The world of prehistory can look stonier, barer, and simpler than it truly was, simply because stone and burned bone are among the few materials stubborn enough to outlast the ages. The same distortion affects shelter. When modern people imagine prehistoric camps, they often imagine exposure, because little stands above ground to prove otherwise. But the absence of standing architecture does not mean the absence of well-made dwellings. In many environments, the practical structures of daily life would have been built from hide, wood, reeds, brush, bone, turf, or other perishable combinations, shaped by local knowledge and repeated experience. Such constructions could be highly effective without leaving obvious ruins. A seasonal camp might once have included sleeping areas, storage spaces, work zones, protected hearths, drying racks, windbreaks, and subtle organization of movement within the site. To archaeologists, that complexity may survive only as post holes if one is lucky, faint stains in sediment, clusters of artifacts, or microscopic residues. More often it survives as an impression too slight to reconstruct with confidence. The people are there, but the structure of their lives is thinned almost to transparency. Burial provides one of the clearest examples of the Earth's uneven mercy. Under exceptional conditions, a prehistoric burial can preserve not only bones but position, grave goods, pigment, pathology, diet signals, even a trace of emotional intent in the care taken with the dead. Such finds can transform understanding in an instant. They reveal kinship possibilities, social obligations, health burdens, childhood stress, violence, tenderness, disability survived long enough to require help from others. But these discoveries are rare precisely because burial preservation is so fragile. Soil chemistry destroys bone in many places. Water movement scatters remains. Later disturbance cuts through graves without leaving a readable pattern. Countless prehistoric dead must lie in places where no trace now survives, or where the surviving trace is too damaged to interpret. For every burial that speaks, there are untold numbers reduced to silence. And silence does not always mean absence of occupation. Erosion can strip entire prehistoric landscapes down to sterile surfaces, carrying away sediments that once sealed camps, tracks, hearths, and refuse. Rivers cut through old deposits and redeposit them elsewhere. Glaciers grind earlier surfaces into oblivion. Coastlines retreat. Wind deflates sediments and exposes only the heaviest materials, scattering artifacts out of context. Caves collapse, preserving one chamber while destroying another. Later humans, animals, roots, and freeze-thaw cycles churn older layers until the sequence blurs. A site that once held a complete human story can become a few displaced tools and a misleading date. Scholars still debate some of the biggest interpretive questions precisely because context is so often partial. A stone tool without secure association may tell us less than a stain in sediment with the right dating and stratigraphy. Preservation is not just about what survives, it is about what survives in place. Then there are the sites that remain physically present but practically inaccessible. Dense forests, deep alluvium, deserts with shifting surfaces, mountain zones prone to landslides, submerged shelves, and politically unstable regions all conceal traces that may exist, but are difficult to locate or excavate. The global map of prehistoric discovery is not the same as the global map of prehistoric life. Some places are studied intensely because they are visible, funded, and accessible. Others remain underexplored not because they lack importance, but because finding and protecting ancient material there is extraordinarily hard. This introduces another bias. The story science can tell is shaped by where science can work. A region rich in caves may seem unusually central to human development simply because caves preserve things better than open country. An arid zone may appear archaeologically vivid because dry conditions save bone, basketry, or dung that humid landscapes erase. A cold cave in one continent can outweigh in the record an entire vanished lifeway from another. Water is both one of the greatest destroyers and one of the strangest preservers. In many ordinary settings, it erodes, dissolves, and transports evidence away. Yet in peat bogs, waterlogged sediments, anoxic mud, or certain lake margins, it can create sealed conditions where organic materials survive with astonishing clarity. A wooden object, a woven fragment, a footprint, a seed assemblage, even soft tissues in later periods, may endure where oxygen and disturbance are limited. This unevenness can make the prehistoric record feel almost capricious. One site yields enough preserved detail to transform a generation of research. Another, perhaps just as important in ancient life, leaves almost nothing at all. From this perspective, every famous site is not merely a discovery. It is an accident of preservation layered over an accident of finding. There is also the problem of scale. Many prehistoric populations are small and mobile. Their camps may be occupied briefly, revisited seasonally, or spread across broad territories in ways that do not create deep, dense deposits. A modern city can generate mountains of debris in a few centuries. A hunter-gatherer landscape used intelligently over millennia may leave only thin scatters, ephemeral hearths, and sparse organic traces. If later processes disturb these, the result can vanish almost completely. This does not mean prehistoric people leave no impact. In some cases they shape fire regimes, animal populations, and vegetation patterns over wide areas. But those effects are harder to tie neatly to individual sites or moments than a wall, a grain pit, or a palace foundation. The archaeological imagination must learn to think in low-density signatures, not just monuments. That low density is one reason ordinary life remains so elusive. We can sometimes reconstruct exceptional acts: a hunt, a burial, a tool-making sequence, a painted cave, a migration corridor. But the repetitive fabric of existence is harder to recover. How were children taught? How were disputes managed? How often did unrelated groups meet? What songs mapped landscapes? Which plants were used not as famine food, but as familiar staples in certain seasons? What counted as beauty in a world of hide, bone, wood, and pigment? How were elders valued when mobility became difficult for them? How much knowledge was gendered, guarded, or restricted by age? Archaeology can approach some of these questions indirectly. An ethnographic comparison can suggest possibilities, but the evidence remains incomplete. The Earth preserves events more readily than relationships. This is why lesser-known details often matter so much. A microscopic residue on a tool edge can imply plant processing invisible to the naked eye. Where patterns on teeth may suggest fiber work or hide preparation, isotopes in bone can reveal mobility or diet shifts across seasons. Ancient DNA extracted from sediment may identify the presence of humans or animals even when no visible bones remain. Burned starch grains, pollen, phytoliths, parasite traces, and chemical signatures can all recover fragments of vanished worlds. Modern science has become astonishingly good at coaxing stories from tiny remains. Yet these advances also underline the scale of what is missing. Each new method opens a window, but usually onto a room already partly collapsed. What survives in the record suggests, again and again, that prehistoric life was denser in meaning and more elaborate in practice than its surviving debris first implies. The people who walk these landscapes know roots, materials, seasons, and one another in ways that make immediate sense to them but leave almost no direct memorial. They build with what the land offers, they wear what decays, they carry containers that rot, they pass on instructions that vanish into air. Their failures and triumphs alike are mostly biodegradable. If later ages inherit little of that world, it is not because it lacked sophistication. It is because sophistication made of skin, wood, grass, memory, and voice is nearly impossible to fossilize. The prehistoric mystery, then, is sharpened by a humbling fact. Science is not trying to reconstruct a lost library from a few damaged books. It is trying to reconstruct entire civilizations of practice from the ash of their campfires and the negative space of what is gone. Every recovered site is surrounded by countless unrecovered ones. Every surviving pattern may hide 100 erased variations. Every answer is shaped by preservation before it is shaped by interpretation. Once that is understood, the silence of prehistory changes meaning. It no longer sounds like evidence of emptiness. It sounds like evidence of tremendous loss. And if so much of daily life has vanished on land, then one possibility becomes harder to ignore. Some of the most important chapters may not just be decayed, they may be physically out of reach, lying beyond the shoreline on drowned plains and ancient coasts where human life may once have flourished most intensely of all. Even in a world already shaped by long ages of cold, the greatest danger is not always the slow pressure of climate over millennia. Sometimes the danger comes when climate shifts too fast for memory to absorb. A valley that supported game for generations turns dry. A familiar migration route breaks. A region that once buffered winter suddenly becomes exposed to harsher winds, thinner vegetation, and longer seasons of scarcity. Lakes retreat. Rivers weaken or jump their channels. Grassland gives way to scrub, or scrub opens into dust-blown plain. In colder zones, abrupt downturns can tighten the grip of frost with shocking severity. In warmer ones, drought can do damage just as profound. For prehistoric humans, these moments are not background fluctuations. They are historical events in the deepest sense, because they decide who can remain, who must move, and who disappears from the record altogether. The image of prehistory as a patient, gradual adaptation to slow environmental change is only partly true. Geological and paleoclimate research increasingly shows that some ancient climate events unfold with unnerving abruptness, not overnight in the literal sense, but fast enough to destabilize systems that depend on patterned expectation. Over a few generations, sometimes less in local effect, rainfall regimes can shift, temperatures can swing, vegetation zones can reorganize, and prey communities can change their range. Human groups living close to ecological thresholds may find that the knowledge inherited from elders remains valuable but no longer sufficient. It is one thing to remember where the herds usually pass. It is another to discover they no longer pass there at all. These shocks matter because prehistoric populations are often small and unevenly distributed. They do not possess vast reserves, bureaucratic granaries, or distant markets from which to import relief. Their resilience lies in mobility, social ties, flexible diet, and accumulated local knowledge. That can be enough, often more than enough, under ordinary strain, but abrupt change tests those strengths to their limit. A group may adapt by broadening its food base, shifting territories, altering hunting strategies, relying more heavily on aquatic resources, or joining with neighbouring communities. Yet every such adaptation carries cost. Mobility can increase conflict. Expanded diet can mean lower returns and higher labour. New territories may already be occupied. Social fusion can strengthen numbers while also placing stress on identity and hierarchy. Survival is rarely elegant. It is improvisation under pressure. This is where bottlenecks enter the story, not as a single dramatic episode everyone agrees on in detail, but as a recurring possibility whenever climate disease, volcanic disruption, habitat fragmentation, or simple bad luck compresses human numbers sharply. The term itself can sound abstract, almost statistical, but the reality behind it is intimate and brutal. A bottleneck means fewer people, fewer mates, fewer skilled elders, fewer alliances, fewer chances for rare knowledge to survive. It means a child may grow up in a world with less inherited technique than her grandparents once knew, not because humanity has become less capable, but because the chain of teaching has thinned. It means innovation can be lost just by the death of a handful of experienced individuals in the wrong season. Some of the most discussed bottleneck hypotheses sit deep in human prehistory, and their exact scale remains debated. Genetic evidence suggests that at certain points, human populations may have fallen to surprisingly low effective numbers, though effective population size is not the same as a head count and must be interpreted carefully. Scholars disagree over the timing and causes of some of these contractions, and the evidence is rarely neat enough to sustain simple narratives. Volcanic catastrophe, especially in connection with the Toba eruption around 74,000 years ago, has often been proposed as a major driver of human stress, perhaps even a near-extinction event for Homo sapiens. Yet the picture has become more complicated with time. Some regions appear less affected than dramatic early versions of the theory proposed. Archaeological continuity in parts of Africa and Asia suggest resilience rather than universal collapse. No single explanation fully accounts for the human patterns around that period. Still, the persistence of the debate itself reveals something important. Prehistoric humanity is vulnerable enough that researchers can plausibly imagine episodes in which the species passes through dangerously narrow gates. Even without a single global catastrophe, regional crises would have been common enough to shape the broader story. A drying phase in East Africa could alter access to fresh water and force populations into smaller refuges. A cold reversal in Eurasia could shrink habitable zones and isolate groups from one another. Sudden climate oscillations near the end of the Pleistocene, including events like the Younger Dryas much later in the story, remind us that warming itself is not always smooth or benevolent. A temporary return to harsher conditions can interrupt trajectories that seemed secure. For people already living near subsistence margins, such reversals are not mere setbacks. They can erase settlement patterns, sever routes of contact, and scatter communities whose material culture later appears to archaeologists as interrupted or mysteriously transformed. Abrupt change also helps explain why prehistory often seems to move in pulses rather than steady climbs. A population may develop a specialized hunting strategy finely tuned to a particular prey base, only to watch that prey decline or shift range. Another may build dense seasonal use around lake margins, then see those waters retreat. Symbolic traditions, social gatherings, exchange routes, and technological routines all depend to some degree on ecological predictability. When that predictability breaks, visible complexity may contract even if the underlying cognitive capacity remains. This is one reason the archaeological record can look so uneven. It may preserve repeated cycles of accumulation and loss, stability and fragmentation, not because humans were incapable of sustained progress, but because their worlds kept changing the rules. There is an especially haunting possibility here. Some prehistoric achievements may have vanished not through ignorance or failure, but through environmental interruption. A group that learns to exploit a coastline brilliantly can lose that niche to marine transgression or climatic deterioration. A network linking distant camps can fragment when intermediary habitats fail. A local tradition of ornament, ritual gathering, or long-distance exchange can disappear because its social base has been dispersed by drought or cold. From the perspective of later archaeology, such disappearances may look like the fading of culture itself. In reality, they may reflect the shattering of conditions that once allowed culture to become visible in durable ways. The animal world around these populations is changing too, and not always gently. Herd structures fluctuate, predator ranges shift, plant communities reorganize, dragging whole ecosystems with them. Humans are never adapting alone. They are adapting inside a moving web of species, some of which they hunt, some of which hunt them, and some of which signal the health of an entire region simply by their presence or absence. A hunter who knows the behavior of reindeer, wild horse, gazelle, or waterfowl is really reading climate through animals. When those animal patterns change, the warning is ecological and existential at once. The land is telling people that the old script can no longer be followed. Yet abrupt climate change does not only destroy, it also creates openings, though never safely. A warming phase may open northern or high-altitude zones previously too severe for repeated occupation. Greener corridors may connect regions once separated by desert or cold steppe. Lakes and rivers can refill, drawing animals and humans into newly attractive landscapes. Refuges become centers of expansion. This is why the prehistoric map never stays still. Human groups contract into protected zones during hard phases, then expand again when conditions improve, carrying with them altered toolkits, altered social ties, and altered experience. These expansions can look like innovation bursts in the archaeological record, but they may also represent the release of capacities preserved through bottlenecks and hardship. There is a quiet cruelty in the fact that success under one climate regime can become vulnerability under the next. The better a group is adapted to a specific ecological pattern, the harder a rapid break may hit. Flexibility is essential, but flexibility itself has limits. People cannot be expert in every environment at once. Skills are costly to learn. Social memory can preserve alternatives, yet not indefinitely. There may be years when the young inherit techniques already mismatched to the world around them. There may be elders who remember wetter ground that their grandchildren have never seen. There may be stories that begin as instruction and end as something like myth, because the landscape they describe no longer exists. This is how climatic shock can become historical amnesia, not total forgetting, but distortion, thinning, and reclassification of memory. A migration route becomes dangerous and then unusable. A former lake becomes a salt flat. A hunting ground becomes open water or brush country. What one generation treats as practical knowledge, the next may receive as ancestral warning, and the generation after that may preserve only as sacred place name or ritual avoidance. Archaeology can glimpse the environmental side of these transformations in sediments, isotopes, pollen, lake cores, and faunal turnover. The human side is harder to catch. It survives indirectly in changed settlement patterns, altered tool assemblages, genetic dispersals, and sudden absences in places once inhabited. The deeper lesson is sobering. Humanity does not spend prehistory climbing steadily towards civilization from a position of security. It spends it repeatedly negotiating with a planet capable of rearranging the terms of life with startling speed. Every later achievement rests on populations that survive such instability, often by margins too thin to see clearly now. Some endure and pass something forward. Others vanish with little more than a broken scatter of tools to show they were ever there. The mystery science still cannot fully explain is not merely how humans became capable, It is how often capability had to be rebuilt under conditions that kept threatening to erase it, and where the pressure of climate is greatest. One possibility returns again with increasing force. The most resilient populations may have turned toward coasts, estuaries, lagoons, and shore-rich ecologies that offered food, movement, and flexibility. If so, then some of the most crucial responses to prehistoric crisis may have unfolded in the very places the sea would later take away. If there is one place where the prehistoric mystery becomes almost unbearable in its implications, it is the ancient coastline, not the coastline as it appears on a modern map, fixed in atlases and ringed with ports, but the shifting shorelines of the late Pleistocene and early Holocene, when sea levels stand far lower than they do today, and the margins between land and water stretch outward across immense exposed shelves. These are not empty edges. They're among the most attractive environments available to human beings. Fresh water meets salt, fish gather in estuaries, shellfish cluster in tidal zones, birds nest in abundance, wetlands offer plants, reeds, and game. Rivers bring nutrients and movement. Driftwood, stone, fibre, and food sources converge. A coastline, in ecological terms, is often an amplifier. It concentrates opportunities. And if prehistoric humans are as adaptable and observant as the evidence increasingly suggests, then it is hard to imagine they would fail to recognize the value of such places. That recognition may be one of the great blind spots in science. The most important coastal landscapes of early human history are often gone. When ice melts and seas rise after glacial periods, low-lying shelves drown, river valleys become bays, marshes turn to open water, estuaries migrate inland, camps, processing sites, seasonal aggregation zones, and perhaps long-inhabited corridors disappear beneath waves and sediment. What remains accessible to archaeology is often the shrunken inland remnant of a much larger living world. The evidence survives unevenly, shell middens from later periods, occasional submerged artifacts, drowned landforms mapped by sonar, rare waterlogged sites, and tantalizing concentrations of finds in places where the sea has revealed rather than concealed. But the broader pattern is painfully clear. Entire coastal chapters of prehistory may lie offshore, inaccessible, damaged, or simply undiscovered. This matters because coasts are not just productive. They're also stabilizing in ways that inland ecosystems sometimes are not. During times of climatic stress, marine and estuarine resources can provide alternative food when terrestrial prey declines or shifts unpredictably. A coastline can offer fish, shellfish, birds, marine mammals, and plant resources with a regularity that buffers the risks of inland hunting. Not every shore is easy to exploit, and not every prehistoric population becomes maritime in any advanced sense. But where technology, local ecology, and social knowledge align, coasts can support densities of human life that leave strong cultural consequences. A people living beside a rich estuary may meet more often, exchange more often, store more food, develop more complex scheduling, and invest more heavily in place-based knowledge than a group forced into constant pursuit across lean interior ground. This has led many researchers to suspect that some major human innovations may have flourished in coastal settings, long before the record can easily prove it. The idea is not fringe, it arises logically from ecology, dispersal patterns, and preservation bias. If early Homo sapiens expands along shore-rich routes out of Africa and across southern Asia, if populations repeatedly use coastal corridors for movement and survival, and if those same corridors are later drowned, then we should expect major evidence to be missing. The missing evidence might include not only campsites but also technological experimentation with watercraft, fishing gear, shell processing, scheduling around tides, and broader social gatherings tied to seasonal abundance. It may even include symbolic or ritual practices anchored in shore landscapes that were especially rich in recurring resources and communal return. The possibility of early watercraft is especially provocative. Direct evidence for ancient boats is vanishingly rare because boats are usually made of wood, reed, hide, or other perishable materials. Yet in several parts of the world, human dispersal seems difficult to explain without some ability to cross water intentionally. The settlement of Sahul, which joins Ice Age Australia and New Guinea, almost certainly requires seafaring beyond mere accidental drift. Even at lower sea levels, open water crossings remain. This means that long before the first written myths of sailors and voyagers, humans are already capable of organizing movement across sea gaps. That implies more than technical skill. It implies planning, coordination, confidence, and perhaps the ability to imagine land beyond immediate sight. Such capacities do not emerge in a vacuum. They likely grow out of repeated contact with literal environments where tides, currents, winds, and shorelines are observed not as abstractions, but as daily facts. And yet the coastal case remains difficult to prove in detail because proof itself keeps drowning. An inland cave preserves pigment and bone for tens of thousands of years and becomes famous. A shoreline camp rich with basketry, net weights, fish traps, wooden stakes, shell refuse, and repeated human gatherings may vanish beneath marine transgression, its sediments disturbed by waves, currents, salt, and later seabed processes. The result is another distortion in our understanding. Inland survivals dominate the story not always because inland life is more important, but because inland preservation is often kinder. We inherit a prehistory tilted away from water, even though water may have been central to human adaptation. This missing coastal world may also help explain one of the oldest puzzles in human behavior: why certain bursts of apparent sophistication seem to arise earlier or more strongly in some regions than others. Coastal habitats can support repeated aggregation, and aggregation changes everything. When groups meet more regularly, information spreads faster, mates circulate more widely, rare skills are less likely to die with a single individual. Ornament and signalling may become more socially useful in larger gatherings. Ritual can take on stronger collective forms. Exchange networks deepen. Innovations in food processing, storage, and tool use can be copied, improved, and passed outward. Demographic threshold theories, which argue that complexity becomes easier to sustain in larger or better connected populations, make particular sense in rich coastal zones. If many such zones are now underwater, then some apparent sudden developments on land may actually be the inland echo of older coastal systems already in motion. There are hints of this in later prehistoric and early Holocene contexts where coastal and riverine exploitation becomes archaeologically clearer. Shell middens grow into enormous accumulations, testimony to repeated use over long periods. Fishing technologies diversify. Sedentism appears in some resource-rich non-agricultural settings, reminding us that dense settlement is not always born directly from farming. Such later evidence does not prove the full shape of earlier coastal life, but it does demonstrate what shore-rich environments can support when preservation happens to cooperate. It becomes easier to imagine earlier, subtler versions of the same principle extending deep into the Pleistocene, especially where migratory routes hug the sea. There is another reason the coastal world matters. Shores are edges, and edges are where knowledge multiplies. A coast teaches weather, currents, tides, seasons of fish runs, nesting patterns, shellfish gathering windows, and the behavior of river mouths under flood. It teaches the difference between sheltered and exposed water, the meaning of drift, the promise of offshore birds, the hazards of storms, the routes by which materials and people can move. A population accustomed to coasts may become not only more food secure in some seasons, but also more mobile in a new sense. Water stops being a barrier alone and becomes, cautiously, a pathway. The mental map of the world changes with that realization. So does the scale of connection. If this is true, then one of science's greatest blind spots is not merely a set of drowned camps, but the possibility of drowned networks. Communities that once seem isolated on the modern map may have been linked by chains of sheltered bays, exposed shelves, and recurring shore stations. Exchange may have travelled along coasts more efficiently than inland topography now suggests. Ideas may have moved through maritime or semi-maritime contact zones lost beneath post-glacial seas. Even myths of origin or sacred geography may once have been anchored to coastlines now erased. The prehistoric world could have been more connected than the surviving record implies, especially at its watery margins. Still, caution is necessary. Not every coast is generous. Some are too rough, too poor in accessible resources, too unstable, or too dangerous for intensive use without specific technologies. Nor should the missing coastal world become a catch-all explanation for every gap in the prehistoric record. It is one factor among many preservation bias. Climate, demography, social learning, migration, and chance all remain crucial. But the coastal hypothesis deserves its power because it answers a real contradiction. If humans are clever, mobile, and ecologically responsive, why would some of the best environments on Earth be archaeologically quiet? The simplest answer is that many are quiet because they are underwater, and there is a deeper melancholy to that thought. Along those vanished shores, there may once have been places known across generations shell banks visited every warm season, shallows where fish were trapped, higher ground above lagoons where children learned the rhythm of tides, meeting grounds where strangers became allies, and promontories where the dead were remembered while the sea still stood farther out. Those places are gone without witness. Their loss leaves modern science studying the margins of a margin, reconstructing shore-centered lives from inland traces and the occasional offering of the seabed. If the coast was one of the great nurseries of prehistoric adaptation, then much of humanity's formative knowledge may have grown in conversation with water, wind, salt, and return. And if so, another possibility follows naturally. Long before writing, long before archives, humans may already have possessed elaborate systems for preserving what mattered most, not on clay tablets or carved stone, but in ritual, practice, apprenticeship, and memory carried from voice to voice. Long before the first mark is pressed into clay to stand for a word, long before ledgers, chronicles, or royal inscriptions attempt to trap thought in durable form, human beings are already living inside systems of memory far more demanding than modern life easily imagines. A prehistoric world without writing is not a world without record. It is a world in which the record must be kept differently in bodies, in repeated actions, in ritualized speech, in seasonal return, in landmarks, in kinship obligations, in songs whose order matters, in stories attached to rivers and ridges, in ceremonies that bind practical knowledge to emotion so firmly that forgetting becomes dangerous. The difficulty for science is that such systems can be elaborate, stable, and essential, while leaving almost no direct archaeological trace. They vanish not because they are weak, but because they are living forms of storage rather than durable ones. This is one of the most important shifts required to think clearly about prehistory. Modern societies often treat writing as the threshold between memory and history, as though all serious preservation begins when words become visible. But that is a bias born of archives. Oral societies, apprenticeship-based societies, and highly mobile societies can preserve enormous amounts of precise information when survival depends on it. Navigation routes, seasonal rounds, weather signs, animal behavior, plant processing, social law, marriage rules, territorial boundaries, ritual obligations, and the proper conduct of mourning or alliance may all be maintained across generations without script. In some cases, the discipline required to preserve such knowledge may be stronger because there is no written external backup. To know is to embody. To forget is not a clerical error. It is a break in the chain of survival. What survives in the record suggests that by deep prehistory, humans already possess the social and cognitive conditions necessary for these kinds of memory systems. They teach complex skills, they coordinate hunts, they move through large territories with repeated seasonal logic. They maintain social identities through ornament and perhaps ritual. They return to certain places over long spans. They care for children who must learn slowly and extensively. None of this proves formal oral tradition in the rich sense ethnographers have documented in later societies, but it strongly implies structured transmission. A hunting route followed over generations is not inherited genetically, it is remembered. A dangerous plant avoided reliably is not avoided by instinct alone, it is taught. A burial practice repeated in a recognizable way is not merely improvised each time, it is socially held. Even where the evidence remains incomplete, the very continuity of prehistoric adaptation points toward memory mechanisms far more intricate than simple imitation in the moment. Ritual may have been one of the strongest supports for such memory. Modern readers often hear the word and think first of religion in its later monumental or doctrinal forms, but ritual in deeper prehistory may have operated as a practical architecture of recall. Repeated acts performed at the right season, in the right place, with the right sequence of gestures, can preserve information with remarkable durability. A gathering tied to animal migration does not only express community, it encodes timing. A procession to a water source may not only signal reverence, it may reaffirm access, route, and obligation. Body painting, dance, chant, and formalized exchange can all do cultural work that is invisible in the archaeological record yet indispensable in life. Scholars still debate how far one can infer ritual from specific prehistoric evidence, and caution is necessary, but the broader principle is difficult to escape. Repetition with meaning is one of humanity's oldest storage technologies. Landscapes themselves may have served as memory devices. This possibility becomes especially compelling in mobile prehistoric worlds, where people cannot depend on fixed buildings full of records, but can depend on repeated return to places whose features do not easily move. A rock outcrop, a bend in a river, a spring, a cave entrance, a coastal promontory, a pass between ridges. These can become anchors for narrative and instruction. One place may be where a herd turns in late autumn. Another may be where a child once drowned and the water must be approached with care. Another may be where two groups exchange goods under truce. Another may be tied to ancestors, origin stories, or the rules governing marriage and movement. In such a world, geography is not just setting, it is indexed knowledge. To walk a route is to pass through a chain of stored meanings. This idea is not romantic speculation. Later and historically documented oral cultures around the world show how densely practical, legal, ecological, and sacred information can be embedded in story and place. That does not mean prehistoric cultures are identical to any known ethnographic example, and direct analogies must always be used carefully. Yet such comparisons help correct a common prejudice, the assumption that non-literate memory is vague, unstable, or purely mythic. In reality, memory without writing can be both imaginative and exacting. It can preserve root sequences, environmental cues, genealogies, resource rights, and seasonal calendars with an accuracy sharpened by need. What writing changes is not the existence of memory, but the medium and scale through which it is externalized. Apprenticeship may have been equally important. Some prehistoric skills are too complex to arise from casual observation alone. Stone knapping at high levels requires sequencing, force control, material knowledge, and error correction that likely depend on prolonged learning. Composite toolmaking requires familiarity with multiple materials and timings. Tracking, hide processing, plant preparation, fiber work, trapping, and perhaps early watercraft use would also have demanded guided practice. A child growing into such a world is not merely copying visible outcomes. He is entering a structured education, even if no formal school exists. The teacher may be a parent, an elder sibling, a specialist, or several people over time. Correction may happen through demonstration, repetition, taboo, praise, exclusion, and narrative warning. Most of that leaves no trace. But the skills themselves, where recovered, imply systems of transmission strong enough to sustain them. There is also the social side of memory, which may be even harder to recover than the technical side. Who is allowed to know which stories are public and which are restricted, which rituals belong only to initiates, elders, hunters, or specific kin groups? How are disputes over memory resolved when there is no written reference? The evidence remains incomplete. But prehistoric societies almost certainly do not distribute all knowledge equally. Some information may be open because everyone needs it. Other information may be guarded because control over memory is itself a form of authority. A landscape rich in resources may require negotiated access encoded in tradition. Marriage alliances may depend on remembered obligations extending far beyond immediate family. Ritual specialists, if such figures exist in certain communities, may serve as living vaults of history, root knowledge, taboo, and proper sequence. This possibility changes the meaning of symbolic artifacts as well. A bead, a pigment pattern, a carved object, a repeated sign in a cave. None may be art in the narrow aesthetic sense modern viewers prefer. They may function as cues within broader systems of memory. Ornament can identify the wearer's ties. Painted surfaces can mark a place already thick with story. Repeated motifs can carry associations taught orally and performed physically. Even seemingly abstract marks may once have mattered, because everyone in a local cultural world knew how to read them in context. When that context dies, the object remains while its grammar vanishes. Archaeology is left with the surviving word from a dead language and no secure dictionary. One reason writing eventually appears so powerful is that it can outlast individuals and travel beyond the range of direct teaching. But before such systems emerge, memory must remain alive by being enacted. That makes prehistoric knowledge both resilient and fragile at once. It can persist for astonishing lengths of time where social continuity holds. Yet it can also be lost quickly when groups fragment. Elders die. Roots become unusable. or ecological shifts render old knowledge less applicable. A coastline drowned by rising sea does not merely erase camps. It may erase a whole mnemonic landscape. A bottleneck that reduces population may not only reduce genetic diversity, it may narrow the range of remembered techniques, songs, rituals, and obligations. In that sense, prehistory may have experienced repeated cultural extinctions invisible in the material record. There is a haunting paradox here. The deepest human past may have been full of memory, but almost all of that memory is now gone, not because prehistoric people failed to preserve their world, but because they preserved it in the only media available to them of voice, repetition, place, gesture, and living relation. These are powerful media in the present and nearly helpless against geological time. A tablet buried in dry mud may survive 5,000 years. A sung route map repeated perfectly for 1,000 years disappears in a single generation if the singers die and the children scatter. The loss can be total. Nothing need remain except perhaps a path, a modified site, or an object severed from its meaning. This helps explain why the prehistoric mystery feels so intimate despite its age. The missing chapters are not missing because humans were absent-minded or undeveloped. They are missing because the things they knew best were stored in the most human way possible, inside other humans. The record that mattered most was breathed, walked, worn, sung, and performed. It was renewed every season, or it ceased to exist. Science can infer its former presence from the complexity of behavior that depends on it, but direct recovery is almost impossible. We can see the outline of memory without hearing its contents. And perhaps that is why one later development becomes so strange when viewed against this immense background. If humans have long possessed the intelligence, memory, and social depth to manage complicated world without writing, then why do they spend so much of prehistory without building the settled agricultural societies that eventually make cities, archives, and states possible? The delay is one of the great puzzles of all. The long delay is one of the most disorienting facts in human history. By the time farming begins to reshape parts of the world, Homo sapiens has already existed for tens of thousands of years. People have crossed continents, entered difficult climates, created ornaments, made pigments, buried some of their dead with care, painted deep caves, navigated shifting coasts, survived abrupt climate shocks, and maintained bodies of knowledge large enough to keep small societies alive across unstable landscapes. In other words, the human mind does not wait for agriculture to become recognizably complex. The capacities are already there. And yet the settled worlds that later generate villages, fields, grain storage, monumental construction, and written administration appear very late in the overall story. That lag demands explanation, because it suggests that civilization is not the automatic outcome of intelligence. Something else governs its timing. For a long time, the delay is interpreted almost backward. Early people are imagined as trapped in simplicity until they finally discover the superior logic of agriculture, after which progress accelerates naturally. But this picture assumes that farming is an obvious improvement once people are clever enough to invent it. The archaeological and anthropological record makes that assumption harder to defend. Farming can support larger populations, but it also ties people to place, narrows diet in many cases, increases labor intensity, encourages disease transmission, creates vulnerability to crop failure, and opens the way to inequality, hierarchy, and coercion. Early agriculturalists are not always healthier than the foragers who precede them. Their teeth may worsen. Their bones may show heavier repetitive stress. Their settlements may expose them to waste, parasites, and contagious illness in ways more mobile populations often avoid. From the perspective of daily well-being, agriculture is not simply a gift waiting to be accepted, it is a trade. That trade only becomes compelling under particular conditions. Mobile or semi-mobile foragers in rich environments can do remarkably well without domesticating plants or animals in the full agricultural sense. A broad-spectrum economy drawing on fish, game, wild cereals, nuts, roots, birds, shellfish, and seasonally abundant plant foods can support stable and knowledgeable communities for immense spans of time. In some especially productive landscapes, people may return to favoured locations repeatedly, build strong territorial familiarity, and even grow relatively dense without becoming farmers. The old assumption that hunting and gathering necessarily means misery, constant crisis, or aimless wandering is one of the great distortions of modern imagination. What survives in the record suggests lives that are often demanding. Yes, but not automatically so poor in return that cultivation would seem irresistibly superior. This helps explain why agriculture does not emerge as soon as humans are cognitively capable of inventing it. Capability is not the same as incentive. People may know plants intimately for millennia before deciding, in limited ways, to protect, tend, replant, or intensify them. They may manipulate landscapes with fire, selective harvesting, and seasonal scheduling without crossing into full domestication. They may manage abundance rather than manufacture it. The line between wild and domestic is often gradual, and scholars still debate the tempo of early cultivation in different regions. But across those debates, one theme recurs. Farming is less a sudden discovery than a slow and uneven commitment. The real mystery is not why people fail to think of it. The mystery is why, after so long, some populations finally find themselves in circumstances where the commitment becomes worthwhile or unavoidable. Climate seems to be part of that answer, especially after the end of the last ice age. As glacial conditions loosen and the Holocene begins, many regions experience greater overall stability than the late Pleistocene world had often allowed. Stability does not mean perfection, and there are still severe reversals. But in some key zones, the environment becomes more predictable in ways that favour repeated use of particular landscapes and closer attention to plant cycles. Wild cereals in Southwest Asia, for example, become especially important in certain ecologies where people are already intensifying their relationship with local resources. Similar processes unfold elsewhere on different timetables with different domesticates. The broad pattern suggests that agriculture emerges not from a single universal breakthrough, but from multiple regional experiments where local opportunity, climatic conditions, and human pressure interact. Population matters too. A small, flexible foraging population can move when local resources thin. A denser population with strong ties to a productive region may find movement less attractive or less possible. Over time, repeated success in rich zones can create demographic pressure of its own. More people survive, more children reach adulthood, territories become more defined, and fallback options narrow. In such conditions, intensifying the use of plants and animals may become a solution to crowding rather than a glamorous innovation. It is not necessarily chosen because it is easier. It may be chosen because alternatives are shrinking. Demographic threshold theories do not explain everything, but they capture something important. The rise of agriculture may depend less on one brilliant invention than on the accumulation of social and ecological pressures that make intensification increasingly rational. There is also a paradox at the heart of settled life. The same species shaped by deep prehistory to remain flexible, mobile, and responsive to fluctuating environments may be slow to embrace systems that reduce flexibility. Farming requires staying put long enough to reap delayed returns. It demands labour invested months ahead of reward. It ties families to fields, stores, seasons, and local risk. It can work brilliantly in the right context, but it also creates new forms of vulnerability. A failed migration can be devastating to foragers. A failed harvest can be devastating to farmers on a scale that spreads through entire communities. To adopt agriculture is therefore not simply to gain control over food, it is to reorganize time, obligation, and risk. Animal domestication complicates the picture further. Herding offers mobility of a different kind and can emerge along pathways somewhat distinct from plant farming. It also requires patience, selection, territorial control, and intimate behavioral knowledge built over generations of interaction with wild herds. Again, the knowledge base already exists long before domestication fully takes shape. Hunters know animal movement exquisitely well. The question is why that knowledge is, in some places, transformed into management rather than pursuit. Part of the answer may lie in post-glacial environmental shift that compress both human and animal populations into closer, more predictable relationships. Part may lie in the social advantages of owning or controlling living wealth. But as with farming, there is no single explanation that fits every region. The pathways are multiple, regional and contingent. This is why the phrase the agricultural revolution can mislead. It suggests one event, one solution, one direction. In reality, there are many beginnings, some partial, some aborted, some prolonged over thousands of years. Cultivation may begin before full domestication. Sedentism may precede farming in especially rich ecologies. Communities may intensify one food source while still relying heavily on broad-spectrum gathering and hunting. Domestic traits in plants appear gradually through repeated selection, often unintentionally at first. The process is messy. It includes hesitation, mixed strategies, reversals, and local peculiarities. Prehistory does not present agriculture as an obvious destiny finally recognized. It presents it as a difficult threshold crossed unevenly. That unevenness itself is revealing. If agriculture were simply the natural next step for any intelligent human population, it should appear quickly and everywhere once the species is established. It does not. Instead, it emerges relatively late, and in particular places where ecological opportunity, social density, and historical contingency intersect. This suggests that the great prehistoric delay is real, not illusory. Humans spend an immense span living successfully without farming because, in many contexts, they can. Their worlds are not waiting passively for villages. They are already functional, meaningful, and often well adapted to the landscapes they inhabit. The eventual rise of agriculture is therefore not proof that earlier lifeways were inferior. It is proof that under certain pressures and possibilities, a different strategy becomes advantageous enough to spread. There is an almost tragic undertone to that realization. Much of what later becomes civilization may begin not from leisure alone, but from narrowing options. Sedentism can arise where abundance invites it, yet dense settlement also increases dependence. Cultivation can secure food, yet it can also trap communities in systems of work from which retreat becomes difficult once population grows. Storage protects against lean years, yet it also invites raiding, inequality, and control. The first long step towards cities is not necessarily a march toward freedom. It may be a bargain made with landscape, climate, and demography. one whose consequences only become visible generations later. And so the delay before farming stops looking like a failure of imagination. It starts to look like evidence of prehistoric skill. For tens of thousands of years, humans remain foragers not because they cannot do otherwise, but because foraging in countless environments is a highly adaptive and often intelligent way of life. Agriculture arrives when conditions change enough that a different system begins to outperform the old one in specific terms, even if it brings costs that no early cultivator could fully foresee. That is why the prehistoric mystery grows more complex the closer one looks. There is no single missing invention, no lone spark withheld for millennia and then suddenly found. There are instead many pressures, many landscapes, many populations, and many thresholds. Civilization does not emerge because humanity finally becomes smart. It emerges because a long-prepared species encounters combinations of stability, density, and risk that make new forms of permanence possible. And even then, the reasons are plural, tangled, and still debated. Which leads directly to the next and perhaps most honest conclusion. When scientists try to explain the lost epoch before civilization, they do not confront one clean answer waiting to be uncovered. They confront a field of overlapping causes, each persuasive in part, none complete on its own. By this point, the temptation to search for one master key becomes almost irresistible. If the prehistoric gap before civilization is so vast, so formative, and so unevenly preserved, then surely there must be some central cause that explains why humanity remains in that long age for so long, and why visible complexity seems to gather only in pulses. It is an understandable desire. Single explanations are clean, teachable, and emotionally satisfying. They promise that if one missing variable can be identified, the darkness will organize itself into a pattern. Perhaps it is cognition, perhaps language, perhaps climate stabilization, perhaps population growth, perhaps coastal abundance, perhaps symbolic thought, social learning, intergroup exchange, or the delayed rise of agriculture. Each of these has been proposed in one form or another, and each captures part of the truth. The trouble is that none of them, taken alone, can bear the full weight of the mystery. Cognitive explanations are often the first to attract attention because they seem to go deepest. If modern humans have brains like ours, then perhaps something in neural wiring, symbolic capacity, or language threshold changes and unlocks the later world. There is an undeniable appeal to this view. The appearance of ornaments, cave art, long-distance exchange, and increasingly elaborate tools seems to hint at inner shifts. Yet the more evidence accumulates, the less convincing a sudden mental revolution appears as a total answer. Signs of symbolic behavior emerge earlier than once assumed. Technical ingenuity appears in contexts too old or too scattered for a single late awakening. Neanderthals and other human relatives likely possess cognitive abilities more substantial than older theories allowed. Meanwhile, many capacities once treated as modern can exist without leading directly to farming, cities, or writing. The evidence remains incomplete, but it increasingly suggests that the human mind is not transformed once in a dramatic leap. It is already capable, then repeatedly enabled or constrained by circumstance. Language sits close to this debate, often just beyond what evidence can securely reach. It is difficult to imagine the social complexity of later prehistory without rich language, teaching, planning, memory, storytelling, territorial negotiation, child rearing, and ritual all become easier when speech can encode subtle distinctions and abstract relations. Some scholars have therefore argued that language in a fully modern sense must be the crucial threshold. But here too, the theory quickly outruns the evidence. Language leaves almost no direct trace. Anatomy, genetics, comparative cognition, and archaeological inference can suggest capacities, but not exact forms or dates. More importantly, even if complex language is ancient, that fact alone does not explain why visible archaeological complexity remains uneven. Language may be necessary for much of what follows, but it is not sufficient to produce settled civilization on its own. Demography offers a more grounded and, in many ways, more persuasive framework. The basic idea is simple when populations are small and scattered. Innovations are fragile. Skills can disappear if too few people carry them. Social networks may be too thin to preserve rare knowledge across bad years. Once populations become larger or more interconnected, ideas spread more reliably. Specialists matter more, and complexity is less likely to die with a single lineage. This helps explain why symbolic practices, technological sophistication, and cumulative culture may appear more stable in some times and places than in others. It also fits well with what is known about bottlenecks and regional contractions. Yet demographic explanations, useful as they are, also leave questions open. Large populations do not automatically create art, agriculture, or writing. Some small groups are highly inventive. Some dense populations remain materially conservative for long periods. Demography helps explain the resilience of complexity more than its original spark. Climate, too, explains a great deal without explaining everything. A volatile Ice Age world punishes permanence and rewards mobility. A more stable Holocene world makes agriculture and dense settlement more feasible. Abrupt drought, cold reversals, and ecological fragmentation can erase traditions, scatter populations, and break lines of transmission. This is all true and indispensable, but climate is not a puppet master. Similar environmental pressures can produce different outcomes in different societies. Rich coasts can support long-lived foraging complexity without farming. Stable periods do not always yield immediate intensification. Harsh conditions sometimes suppress visible elaboration, and sometimes seem to sharpen cooperation. Ritual and innovation. Climate sets terms, but humans still answer those terms through culture, memory, and social choice. The coastal hypothesis, increasingly influential, adds another essential layer. If many of the most productive prehistoric habitats are now underwater, then our entire picture is biased inland. Innovations in diet, mobility, networking, perhaps even early seafaring or sustained aggregation, may have developed strongly in places the sea later erased. This is one of the most compelling explanations for why the record feels so incomplete, and why some apparent beginnings on land may in fact be survivals from older, drowned systems. Yet even here restraint is necessary. A missing coastal world can explain absence of evidence. It cannot be allowed to explain everything automatically. Not all shorelines were intensively used. Not every gap conceals a drowned center of innovation. The coastal case is powerful precisely because it corrects a preservation bias, not because it replaces all other causes. Social learning theories focus on another crucial point. Culture may not accumulate steadily unless transmission is dense, repetitive, and protected from disruption. A tool is more than an object. It is a teaching chain. A symbolic practice is more than a gesture. It is a convention recognized by others. In this view, complexity grows where communities are interconnected enough to support cumulative knowledge, and where young learners are numerous enough to maintain it. This can help explain why long stretches of prehistory show remarkable competence without obvious runaway accumulation. Knowledge may remain local, sufficient and highly effective without becoming visibly expansive. Still, this approach too can only take us so far. It clarifies how traditions survive, but not always why certain kinds of traditions become necessary or desirable in the first place. Then there are explanations centered on social competition. Once populations gather more densely, signaling matters more. Ornament becomes more meaningful. Alliances become more formal. Ritual grows more elaborate. Feasting, prestige display, and symbolic differentiation can intensify innovation, storage, exchange, and eventually hierarchy. This line of thinking is especially relevant for the late prehistoric world approaching the first villages and more settled communities. It helps explain why abundance does not simply lead to comfort, but sometimes to intensified social complexity. Yet it is less satisfying as an explanation for the whole long prehistoric span. Competition can magnify existing developments, but it presupposes a degree of demographic and ecological concentration not always present earlier. Some researchers emphasize the importance of niche construction. Instead, humans do not merely adapt to environments, they increasingly modify them through fire, selective harvesting, animal pressure, movement patterns, and later, more obvious cultivation. Over long periods, these interventions may gradually reshape ecosystems in ways that favor further human dependence and further intervention. This is an elegant idea because it blurs the sharp divide between foraging and farming. It suggests that the road to civilization is not a single leap from passive use to active control, but a slow ratcheting process in which humans and landscapes alter one another. That almost certainly captures part of the truth, but once again, no single explanation fully accounts for the vast differences in timing and outcome across regions. The most honest picture is therefore plural. The prehistoric world does not withhold one answer. It presents a mesh of conditions that reinforce, interrupt, or cancel one another depending on place and time. A small population in a rich coastal zone may support high connectivity without farming. A large inland population in an unstable climate may intensify food production, but lose symbolic richness in the record through preservation failure. A stable corridor may allow expansion, intergroup exchange, and innovation, only for later drought to sever the network and erase much of what had formed there. Cognitive capacity, language, memory, climate, demography, ecology, and geography all interact. None is trivial, none is sovereign. This plural answer is less dramatic than a single breakthrough, but it is more faithful to the evidence. It also changes the meaning of the prehistoric gap itself. The gap is not empty time waiting for the right invention. It is a long field of repeated near beginnings, local solutions, fragile continuities, and vanished experiments. Some capacities appear early but remain lightly expressed because populations are sparse. Some become visible only when ecological richness and social connectivity align. Some are lost in bottlenecks, some are drowned. Some survive only as indirect effects in genes, myths, or unexpectedly persistent techniques. Humanity before civilization is not stalled. It is busy, but often busy in ways that do not harden into the monumental forms later ages recognize most easily. There is dry irony in this. The more science learns, the less satisfying the old hunt for a single origin becomes. Instead of one clean dawn, we find many horizons brightening and fading at different times. Instead of one invention creating civilization, we find a species long prepared in pieces, meeting opportunity unevenly. Instead of a straight ascent, we find loops, pauses, thresholds, reversals, and paths abandoned not because they failed in some absolute sense, but because conditions shifted. And that is perhaps the strongest answer available. 1,000 beginnings may be closer to the truth than one. Humanity becomes itself through accumulation, contact, stress, memory, and chance. And the reason the prehistoric mystery remains unsolved is that the formative age was never one story. It was many stories, most of them unfinished, many of them erased, and several of them still only visible at the edges. What survives is enough to show that no single cause rules the deep past. What does not survive ensures the argument remains open. That openness matters, because once one stops searching for a solitary explanation, another pattern comes into view. The long prehistoric age may not simply be a build-up towards civilization. It may be a cycle of gains as losses, where catastrophe repeatedly interrupts momentum and forces human communities to start again from less than they once knew. One of the quietest assumptions people bring to the deep past is that whatever is learned stays learned. A better tool appears, and from that moment forward humanity supposedly keeps it. A useful practice emerges, and naturally it spreads, or persists. A social breakthrough is made, and later generations inherit it as part of an upward climb. This assumption is comforting because it makes history feel cumulative by default. Yet prehistory offers a different and less reassuring picture. In many times and places, gains are fragile. Knowledge can narrow, techniques can vanish, roots can close, populations can shrink to the point where what was once normal becomes impossible to sustain. Progress, in the deep human past, is not a staircase. It is often a fire in bad weather, protected for a while, then lost, then lit again somewhere else by people who may not know it ever burned before. Catastrophe is part of that pattern, but catastrophe in prehistory rarely arrives with the clarity of a single named event. More often it is distributed across landscapes and generations, a run of failed seasons, a prey collapse, a drying lake system, a violent cold reversal, a coastline retreating beyond easy adaptation, a flood that destroys a recurring camp, a disease moving through a small network, a volcanic ashfall that turns familiar ground hostile, a corridor of movement closing under new environmental pressure. Any one of these can weaken a group. Several in sequence can do something worse. They can break continuity. And continuity is the real treasure in a non-literate world. Once the chain of transmission breaks, even highly capable people may have to improvise under harsher conditions with less inherited guidance than those before them possessed. This is easiest to see in small populations, where every skilled adult matters disproportionately. A master toolmaker dies in a bad winter. A knowledgeable elder who remembers distant fallback routes does not survive a migration. A woman whose experience with plant processing once kept a group fed through lean seasons is lost in an epidemic, an accident, or childbirth. The immediate grief is one thing, the long-term consequence is another. In a world without written records, preserved diagrams, or secure stores of institutional knowledge, every death can remove part of the library. Most of the time, communities compensate. Skills are shared, children learn, memory is distributed, but under repeated strain the margin shrinks. Eventually, something once common may become rare, then disappear. Not because no one could understand it, but because too few remain to teach it well. That possibility helps explain one of the most unsettling features of the archaeological record, the appearance of regression, where modern instincts expect continuity. A region may show sophisticated use of certain materials or symbolic practices. Then later, evidence appears thinner, simpler, or more localized. It is tempting to treat that as failure of interpretation, and sometimes it is. Preservation bias, excavation limits, and uneven sampling account for much confusion, but not always. Sometimes the most straightforward explanation is loss. A population contracts, mobility changes, exchange networks collapse. A specialized practice no longer pays for itself. A ritual cycle breaks because the gathering places are no longer safe or accessible. A technology requiring rare materials or repeated instruction fades when its support system disappears. What looks like backward movement may simply be survival after disruption. Catastrophe can also erase infrastructure that never becomes monumental enough for later detection. A seasonal rendezvous site central to marriage alliances and information exchange might be abandoned after repeated flooding. A coastline rich in shellfish and fish runs might become less dependable as sea levels rise and estuaries shift. A mountain pass used for generations may close under advancing ice or become too risky after slope failures and altered weather. In each case, the loss is not merely geographic, it is social. Routes do not only connect places, they connect memories, obligations, and opportunities for reinvention. When a route fails, isolation deepens. Once groups become more isolated, cultural divergence accelerates while resilience may weaken. This is one reason catastrophe and reinvention so often travel together. Human beings are remarkably good at finding new ways to live after old ones fail. They broaden diets, change territories, adopt unfamiliar prey, experiment with new composite tools, modify clothing, shift the timing of movement, and rework social relations to fit altered conditions. In some cases, these responses may even create the innovations later generations mistake for straightforward progress. Pressure can force creativity. Scarcity can break attachment to older routines. Contact between displaced groups can transmit ideas in new combinations. But reinvention is not the same as uninterrupted accumulation. A group under duress may invent brilliantly in one domain while losing depth in another. It may become more flexible but less ceremonially elaborate, more mobile but less connected, more technically efficient but socially thinner. Survival chooses unevenly. The extinction of the large animals in some regions may have intensified this pattern. The late Pleistocene and early Holocene witnessed major losses in megafauna across various parts of the world, though the causes differ by region and remain debated. Climate stress, human hunting pressure, ecological cascade, and combinations thereof all likely play roles. For human communities, the disappearance of large prey is not just a dietary adjustment. It can mean the collapse of an entire way of organizing labor, movement, and material use. Large mammals provide meat, fat, bone, hide, sinew, and often predictable movement patterns around which social life can be structured. When they diminish or vanish, people must reorganize. Smaller prey, fish, birds, gathered plants, and more varied processing strategies may replace part of the old economy. But that shift can demand new knowledge and render old expertise less central. Reinvention follows, but it follows loss. There is a psychological dimension to this as well, even if archaeology can only touch it indirectly. A people repeatedly forced to abandon favoured landscapes may become culturally marked by precaution, flexibility, and mistrust of permanence. Stories may carry warnings coded as myth. Ritual may become a way of stabilizing order against environmental unpredictability. Burial practices may change when the dead can no longer be laid in ancestral ground. Material culture may simplify not because minds narrow, but because portability and speed suddenly matter more than display. Disaster does not merely remove resources, it changes the emotional texture of a society's relationship with place and time. In that sense, the long prehistoric age may contain many worlds that almost became something else. Communities may have edged toward greater density, stronger aggregation, more complex signalling, broader exchange, or more intensive management of resources, only to be struck by climatic reversal, dispersal, drowning coastlines, or demographic collapse. The archaeological record then preserves the beginning of an arc without its fulfillment. Later researchers are left wondering why a promising pattern fades. Sometimes the answer may be brutally simple. The people carrying it are scattered faster than they can rebuild it. The future is delayed not by lack of capacity, but by repeated interruption. There is even room for dry understatement here. Humanity may have spent a good portion of prehistory inventing its way out of trouble, caused by the same planet that later textbooks reduced to background scenery. The species survives, yes, but often by abandoning efficiencies it had just learned in order to cope with new problems arriving from climate, prey shifts, flooding, or sheer geographical bad luck. A useful route becomes a dead end. A rich zone becomes hostile. A successful adaptation becomes obsolete. Under such conditions, it would be surprising if cumulative progress was smooth. It would be surprising if it were not broken, restarted and patched together many times. This also reframes the rise of later civilization. By the time villages, farming systems, and eventually cities begin to anchor human life more durably, they are not appearing in a world where nothing significant has happened before. They are appearing after a very long era in which significant things may have happened repeatedly and then been partially erased. Some advances survive because stable conditions finally allow them to compound. Others survive because larger populations make loss less likely. Others perhaps survive because the environments most conducive to continuity at last become widespread enough to support long-term storage, fixed architecture, and growing demographic momentum. In that light, civilization begins to look not only like a breakthrough, but like a rare stretch of continuity after an age defined by interruption. Still, even catastrophe does not act alone. Some losses are sudden, some incremental, some are local, some continental in effect, some destroy people, others only the ecological arrangements that made a certain lifeway possible. And because the evidence is partial, scholars must be careful not to turn every gap into a disaster narrative. Yet the cumulative logic remains compelling. The deep prehistoric mystery may persist in part because humanity is not only creating culture across those lost millennia, it is repeatedly recovering from the destruction of culture, often without leaving enough behind for later science to measure the full scale of what vanished. That may be one of the hardest truths in the whole story. Much of the missing epoch before civilization may not be missing because nothing had yet been built. It may be missing because so much was built in forms too fragile to survive repeated blows. Knowledge, roots, alliances, symbolic systems, seasonal gatherings, local specializations, perhaps even early experiments in greater complexity, all could be reduced to ash, distance, silence, and replacement. What endures is not a record of uninterrupted ascent, but a species astonishingly skilled at beginning again. And despite all that loss, not everything disappears. Some traces remain folded inside the present, in the body, in deep structures of culture, in stories, in inherited resistances, in recurring habits of tool use and movement, as if the vanished world still presses faintly through the skin of later history. The vanished world before civilization is not entirely gone. It cannot be, because nothing so long and so formative disappears without residue. Even when the camps are erased, the coasts drowned, the tools broken, and the memory systems severed, some traces pass forward in altered form. They survive where deep history has always hidden best in the body, in inherited patterns of adaptation, in faint continuities of practice, and perhaps in stories so transformed by time that only their structure, not their original setting, still remains. The difficulty is that these echoes are subtle. They do not stand up and announce themselves as messages from the Ice Age. They appear instead as scattered survivals that science can sometimes detect, sometimes suspect, and sometimes only approach with caution. Genetics offers some of the clearest of these survivals, though it also introduces its own complications. Ancient DNA has transformed the study of prehistory because it allows later populations to be connected, however imperfectly, to movements and admixtures once visible only through bones and tools. The discovery of Neanderthal and Denisovan ancestry in living people is the most famous example, but the broader lesson runs deeper. Human populations carry the history of migrations, bottlenecks, separations, and contact in patterns of variation that can sometimes be read across tens of thousands of years. Genes do not preserve culture in any simple way, and they do not map neatly onto identity or behavior. But they do preserve the fact of relationship. They show that the prehistoric world is not dead ground behind us. It remains biologically entangled with the present. Sometimes those inherited traces are not merely neutral remnants, they are useful. Certain genetic variants linked to ancient admixture or local adaptation appear to have helped later populations survive under specific conditions. High-altitude adaptation in parts of Asia is one of the clearest cases where inherited archaic ancestry may have contributed to physiological success in thin-air environments. Immune-related genes, too, may preserve ancient bargains struck through contact with different human groups and different disease ecologies. These are extraordinary survivals. They suggest that prehistoric encounters are not simply background episodes long outgrown. They may still shape how bodies function now. A vanished people can leave behind no monuments and yet still alter the blood, breath, and resistance of those who come after. But biology is only one archive. Tool traditions sometimes preserve equally haunting echoes, not because a specific hand style can always be traced without interruption across immense spans, which would be far too simple, but because certain ways of solving practical problems recur with astonishing persistence. The handling of stone, the shaping of points, the preparation of fibers, the use of pigments, the exploitation of recurring animal behavior, all may endure regionally in ways that suggest long cultural memory, even when the exact chain of transmission cannot be reconstructed. A technique preserved in a later foraging society is not automatically a fossil from the Paleolithic, yet neither should continuity be dismissed out of hand. Human beings are conservative in some domains for good reason. If a method works reliably in a certain environment, it may survive because the environment keeps rewarding it. There are also deeper structures of habit that may reach farther back than any single artifact type. Seasonal mobility, coastal opportunism, broad-spectrum foraging, the social importance of aggregation sites, the division of labour around age and skill. All of these appear in many later societies and may preserve not exact copies of prehistoric lifeways, but inherited solutions to recurring problems. The temptation here is to romanticize continuity or flatten difference, and that must be resisted. Later peoples are not museum fragments of the deep past. They are fully historical communities with their own changes, disruptions, and innovations. Yet the recurrence of certain patterns across wide spans of time suggests that some prehistoric achievements are durable, precisely because they are so well fitted to human needs in fluctuating environments. Language is harder. There is no direct road from the speech of deep prehistory to any known modern tongue. The time depth is too great, the branching too complex, the evidence too fragmentary, and yet linguists, anthropologists, and cognitive researchers alike have often sensed that some very ancient features of human social life may still echo in the kinds of structures languages everywhere seem built to express kinship, obligation, place, movement, animacy, sequence, taboo, number, time, and the constant negotiation between what is public and what is restricted. This is not a claim that particular words survive from the prehistoric mystery. It is the more modest and perhaps more profound observation that language itself may bear the shape of worlds where memory had to travel socially, not textually. A species that spends most of its history preserving knowledge in speech is likely to make speech do far more than label things. Myth presents an even more difficult case, but perhaps the most emotionally powerful one. Around the world, later traditions preserve stories of floods, ancestral wanderings, lost lands, culture bringers, star knowledge, dangerous thresholds, transformations of landscape, and the moral burden of remembering roots, seasons, or taboos. It would be naive to treat every such story as a direct fossil from the Pleistocene. Myths change, absorb new meanings, and are shaped by later religion, politics, and local experience. Scholars are rightly cautious. Still, it would be equally naive to assume that oral cultures preserve nothing of deep environmental memory. In some cases, traditions associated with coastlines, volcanic events, sea level change, or unusual landforms may encode recollections of real ancient transformations, even if filtered through centuries or millennia of retelling. The evidence remains incomplete and often contested, but the possibility is difficult to dismiss entirely. A shoreline drowned long ago may leave not a map but a story of forbidden water, a vanished path, or land taken by the sea. Place itself can preserve echoes, sacred sites, repeated pathways, favoured camps, and long-used meeting grounds may endure across astonishing spans, even as the meanings attached to them change. A cave decorated in the Paleolithic can later be entered by entirely different people for entirely different reasons, yet the fact of return may still matter. A spring, a mountain pass, a river bend, or a coastal headland may remain important not because one culture hands it directly to the next in unbroken continuity, but because landscapes of unusual power keep drawing human attention. In this way, the present can inherit the prehistoric world not only through direct descent but through repeated recognition. Certain places remain memorable because they were always memorable. Modern scientific methods have made some of these faint survivals easier to detect. Isotopic analysis can reconstruct ancient mobility and diet. Sedimentary DNA can reveal human and animal presence where no bones remain. Proteomics can draw biological information from fragments once thought mute. Paleoenvironmental reconstruction can show when a mythically charged landscape was once a wetland, a coast, a grassland corridor, or a drowned basin. These tools do not solve the mystery, but they deepen the sense that the present is full of hidden attachments to the lost epoch. Every new method seems to say the same thing in a different language, more survived than we once thought, but less survived than we need. There is a dry and slightly unsettling irony in that. The closer science gets to the deep past, the more it finds that the present is crowded with ancient residue it was never designed to notice. Human bodies carry archaic ancestry. Landscapes preserve old choices under later surfaces. Ritual forms may outlast the worlds that first made them necessary. Stories may retain environmental warnings after the original terrain is gone. Practical habits may repeat solutions discovered thousands of generations before anyone wrote them down. Civilization often imagines itself as a clean break from what came before. The evidence suggests something messier and more interesting. The old world persists inside the new one like a half-erased underdrawing. And yet the echoes are never enough. Genes can show contact, not conversation. Tools can show continuity of practice, not the emotions or cosmologies that once gave practice meaning. Stories can hint at ancient memory, but rarely with certainty strong enough to satisfy every skeptic. Sacred places may be reused for reasons impossible to disentangle. The prehistoric world survives in shards and reverberations, not in a full recovered voice. We can tell that the lost epoch shaped everything after it. We cannot fully restore how that shaping felt from within. Perhaps that is why the mystery endures so strongly. The traces in the present are just enough to make the absence larger. They prove that the deep past is not sealed away behind us. It remains active, distributed through biology, habit, landscape, and memory. But because those traces are partial, they also remind us how much cannot be retrieved. The human story before civilization is still there, pressing faintly through later layers, but not in a form that yields easily. And that brings the argument to its hardest edge. After all the tools of archaeology, genetics, climate science, and underwater exploration, there are still questions the evidence may never answer cleanly, not because no answer exists, but because too much of the record has gone beyond recovery. There is a point in every deep historical inquiry where the problem stops being lack of effort and becomes a limit built into reality itself. The prehistoric mystery reaches that point often. Archaeologists dig more carefully than ever. Geneticists recover information from fragments once thought useless. Paleoclimatologists read ice, pollen, lake cores, and cave deposits as if they were scattered pages of a planetary diary. Underwater researchers map drowned landscapes, searching for traces on the seabed that might redraw the map of early human life. The machinery of modern science has never been more powerful. And still, there are places where the record thins into silence so complete that even the best methods can only circle its edges. That is not failure in any ordinary sense. It is the hard boundary imposed by time, erosion, chemistry, drowning shorelines, and the fact that most human life was never designed to fossilize. One of the clearest limits is simply missing ground. Entire coastal plains that once held rivers, marshes, camps, and perhaps long-term aggregation zones are now underwater beneath sediment. Currents, trawling damage, and the logistical difficulty of marine archaeology. In theory, they are still there. In practice, finding and interpreting them is enormously difficult. A single submerged landscape may cover vast areas that would take decades to survey properly, and even then the traces most worth finding may be small, disturbed, or sealed under later deposits. A shell concentration, a scatter of worked stone, a drowned channel edge that once attracted repeated occupation, these do not announce themselves easily. The seabed is not a museum floor waiting to be searched. It is a hostile archive. Even on land, the limits are severe. Tropical regions can erase organic remains with astonishing speed. Acidic soils dissolve bone. Wind strips ancient surfaces bare. Rivers remove the very layers that once preserved camps. Glaciers grind entire landscapes into unreadable rubble. Later human settlement builds over earlier traces, while agriculture, industry, looting, and simple chance distort context that might otherwise have spoken clearly. A site can survive physically and still become scientifically mute if its layers are mixed, stripped, or too fragmentary to date securely. Science works miracles with small clues, but miracles have thresholds. Beyond a point, the evidence is not hidden, it is gone. Then there is the problem of invisibility by design. Much of what mattered most in prehistoric life is behavior that does not leave a durable signature even under favorable conditions. A teaching conversation leaves nothing. A myth recited perfectly for centuries leaves nothing unless it later attaches to a recoverable tradition. The emotional force of mourning, the tension of negotiation between groups, the social rank conveyed by a gesture, the soundscape of ritual, the logic by which a child learns when to speak and when to remain silent. None of this fossilizes. Archaeology can infer complexity from its material supports. It can show that such things must have existed in some form, but it cannot usually restore them in detail. This is a limit not just of technology, but of the medium itself. Human life is richest where the earth is least obliged to preserve it. Chronology imposes another restraint. The farther back one goes, the harder it becomes to tie events, behaviors, and populations into a single continuous narrative. Dates come with error ranges. Associations between artifacts and human remains may be suggestive but not definitive. One cave preserves a symbolic trace, another preserves a tool tradition, a third preserves climatic evidence, and fitting them together across regions can require careful inference rather than direct proof. Scholars still debate many major transitions not because they are careless, but because the deep past is genuinely patchy. Small shifts in dating can alter migration sequences. A new genetic sample can complicate an apparently settled model. A submerged landscape discovered tomorrow could reframe decades of assumptions about where innovation clustered. The mystery remains open in part because the data are always incomplete enough to allow multiple serious interpretations. This is especially true when science reaches for motives. Why does a group adopt one technology and not another? Why does one symbolic practice persist while another vanishes? Why do some populations intensify food production and others remain highly successful foragers? Why does one region preserve bursts of art and ornament while another seems materially quieter? Material evidence can constrain the range of plausible answers, but it rarely yields motive in a pure form. Human decisions are shaped by ecology, yes, but also by custom, taboo, memory, prestige, fear, and timing. Those forces are the most difficult to see archaeologically. No single explanation fully accounts for them because explanations at that level inevitably become probabilistic. We can say what likely mattered. We can rarely say with final certainty what ancient people themselves believed they were doing. There is also a danger in success. Every breakthrough in the science of prehistory can create the illusion that the last darkness is about to be cleared away. Ancient DNA arrives and seems to promise a complete human family map, but then it reveals ghost populations and admixture events without neat cultural labels. Underwater mapping improves and suggests drowned landscapes of enormous importance, but field verification remains slow and partial. High-resolution climate records sharpen the timing of environmental change, but linking those changes directly to specific human decisions remains difficult. Better methods do not eliminate uncertainty. Often they refine it, showing the problem in greater detail rather than resolving it entirely. This is progress, but it is a humbling kind of progress. What survives in the record suggests strongly that the lost epoch before civilization is not a void. It is crowded with adaptation, memory, contact, ingenuity, and repeated transformation. but there may be parts of that crowding we never recover. We may never know how many important coastal settlements were taken by the sea before archaeology existed. We may never know how many symbolic traditions flourished in wood, fibre, skin, or body paint, and then vanished without a trace. We may never know whether some populations achieved forms of seasonal aggregation, social ranking, or ritual elaboration that left too little durable evidence to satisfy later science. We may never know the full contents of prehistoric memory systems, only the necessity that such systems once existed. This does not make the inquiry hopeless. On the contrary, it makes each surviving clue more valuable. A single footprint can reveal group movement, pace, and the presence of children. A few teeth can redraw a migration. Sediment D. A can show occupation where no bones remain. A submerged river channel can imply an entire lost corridor of life. The field advances because the silence is not absolute, it is perforated. New methods keep opening pinholes through which larger shapes can be glimpsed. Yet it remains crucial to distinguish between what can likely be known and what may remain forever inferential. The discipline is strongest when it admits that difference openly. There is something almost philosophical in that admission. Civilization often flatters itself by imagining that enough knowledge can recover anything. But deep time does not work that way. Some losses are not temporary gaps in research. They are permanent reductions in what the universe still contains. Once a coastline has drowned, its camps broken, its stories unsung, its fibres rotted, and its bones dissolved. Later science works with consequences, not full originals. It can approach the lost world asymptotically, drawing nearer without fully touching it. That is not a weakness of human curiosity. It is the cost of being a species whose formative age occurred mostly before durable self-documentation. And yet perhaps the limit itself tells us something important. It forces us to stop treating prehistory as a crude waiting room for civilization. The very fact that so much essential human life is archaeologically elusive suggests that significance cannot be measured only by what leaves monuments. The lost epoch shaped language, social learning, mobility, adaptation, symbolic capacity, and the basic human ability to survive one another and the planet. Those achievements do not become lesser because their evidence is fragmentary. If anything, the fragility of the record makes them more impressive. Humanity became itself largely in forms that geology was never obliged to keep. So science reaches outward and downward as far as it can, and what it finds is enough to overturn old contempt, enough to reveal richness, and enough to prove that the silence is deceptive. But it is not enough to close the case. The unanswered questions are not loose ends at the fringe, they are built into the centre of the story. The deepest age of human becoming remains partly beyond reach, because its traces were always vulnerable, and because the world that formed us was always in the process of erasing itself. That recognition changes the tone of the mystery at the end. The question is no longer just what happened before civilization, or even why the evidence is thin. The question becomes what it means that the least understood part of human history may also be the part that mattered most. The immense and unrecorded age in which almost everything later humans take for granted was first tested against cold, distance, hunger, memory, and time. By the end of the long prehistoric age, civilization begins to appear on the horizon like something new. But it is not new in the simple way later ages like to imagine. It does not rise from emptiness. It rises from a depth so vast that most of it remains unseen. Behind the first villages, behind cultivation, behind walls, storage pits, shrines, and eventually writing, lies an immeasurable stretch of human experience in which almost every faculty later associated with civilization has already been tested in more fragile forms. Cooperation exists long before bureaucracy. Memory exists long before archives. Symbol exists long before script. Territorial knowledge exists long before maps. Social obligation exists long before law codes. The great mystery science still cannot fully explain is not how these things appear from nothing, but how they persist, disappear, and reassemble across tens of thousands of years before finally becoming durable enough to leave the dense material signatures later historians mistake for beginnings. That is why the prehistoric world casts such a long shadow. It is not merely earlier than civilization, it is formative in a deeper sense. It is the age in which humanity learns to live by reading land, weather, animal movement, season, risk, and one another with extraordinary precision. It is the age in which people survive cold severe enough to redraw continents, drought strong enough to empty corridors, and seas powerful enough to erase entire homelands. It is the age in which memory must travel in the body, in speech, in ritual, in repeated movement, because nothing else can carry it. It is the age in which multiple humans share the earth, meet, vanish, and partly remain inside later populations. It is the age in which coasts rich with possibility may foster innovations later swallowed by rising water. It is the age in which gains are made and unmade so often that progress itself becomes difficult to recognize in the surviving record. Seen from that distance, civilization begins to look less like the invention of humanity and more like the concentration of capacities that were ancient already. Farming does not create foresight. Writing does not create memory. Cities do not create cooperation. They harden such things. They scale them. They trap them in material forms more resistant to time. What had once been carried by voice can now be stored on clay. What had once required repeated return to place can now be governed from a fixed center. What had once lived in fragile seasonal networks can now be reinforced by architecture, fields, property, and administration. But the underlying capacities are older than the walls that eventually contain them. They are inherited from a world of movement and uncertainty that modern imagination too often reduces to a primitive blur. This is where the emotional force of the mystery becomes hardest to ignore. The least understood part of the human story may be the part that shaped us most completely. For the overwhelming majority of our existence, people live without texts but not without intelligence, without cities but not without order, without monuments but not without memory. They improvise and endure across landscapes now vanished. They carry knowledge in forms that leave almost nothing behind. They adapt again and again to a planet that seems determined to test the limits of flexibility. If later civilizations feel astonishing, it is partly because they condense into visible form what prehistory had spent uncounted generations refining in less durable media. And yet the shadow is long not only because of what was built there, but because of what was lost there. Every major theme of the prehistoric mystery returns to loss. Lost coastlines, lost routes, lost populations, lost traditions, lost symbolic worlds that may once have been vivid and binding, but are now reduced to pigment stains, beads, engravings, and the occasional preserved burial. Lost episodes of adaptation that never became permanent enough to survive intact. Lost explanations. The silence that covers the deep past is not the silence of nothingness. It is the silence after repeated erasure. That distinction matters. It turns prehistory from a blank prelude into a graveyard of partial survivals, a place where humanity is active, inventive, and often sophisticated, but where time keeps destroying the very evidence that would allow later ages to appreciate the full scale of what was achieved. There is also a humbling implication in this. If so much of the human story can vanish, then permanence is less natural than civilizations usually assume. Cities often imagine themselves as the secure centre of history, the point from which disorder is measured outward. But the longer view suggests the opposite. Mobility is older than settlement. Adaptation is older than permanence. Reinvention is older than institutions. The first states and literate societies emerge only after a very long apprenticeship in uncertainty. Even then, they never fully escape it. Climate still shifts, crops still fail, populations still move, knowledge can still be lost. The prehistoric world is not merely behind civilization, it continues to haunt it, reminding every settled order that stability is an achievement, not a default. This may be why the mystery remains so compelling, even as evidence improves. It is not only an archaeological puzzle, it is a challenge to modern self-understanding. The deeper we look, the less convincing it becomes to treat civilization as the beginning of seriousness. Human beings are already serious long before cities. They are already burdened by survival, memory, obligation, and meaning. They are already capable of adaptation so sophisticated that its perishable details exceed what stone tools alone can convey. The gap before civilization is therefore not a waiting room. It is the main arena in which the species is shaped. Civilization arrives late to a story already ancient, and that lateness changes the scale of everything. A written dynasty lasting 500 years can feel immense within recorded history. A farming tradition of 3,000 years can seem enduring beyond measure, but set against the deep prehistoric span, such durations contract. The first cities become recent, bronze becomes recent, script becomes recent. The familiar human world begins to look like the thinnest upper layer over an abyss of forgotten adaptation. Beneath every archive lies a time when people had no archive except one another. Beneath every road lies a time when movement followed animal tracks, river bends, stars, and remembered danger. Beneath every border lies a time when landscapes opened and closed according to ice, rain, prey, and retreating shorelines rather than law. No single explanation fully accounts for why this formative age remains so elusive. Climate instability explains part of it. Preservation bias explains part of it. Drowned coasts explain part of it. Bottlenecks, fragile knowledge systems, and repeated catastrophe explain part of it. Demography, social learning, and the slow conditions required for agriculture explain more. But in the end, the deepest answer may be that prehistory is hard to explain because it is not one thing waiting for one solution. It is the sum of innumerable human worlds, most of them lightly built, many of them erased, all of them occurring before the kind of durable self-description later ages mistake for the only real history. What survives is enough to overturn the old contempt. It is enough to prove that early humans are not drifting creatures of bare instinct, but experts in movement, memory, and adaptation. It is enough to show that symbolic life, social complexity, and technical ingenuity run deeper than once believed. It is enough to reveal that other humans once lived beside our ancestors and left something of themselves within us. It is enough to suggest that some of the most important evidence lies underwater or dissolved forever. It is enough to tell us that civilization stands on foundations laid in darkness. But it is not enough to restore the whole lost epoch. The greatest prehistoric mystery remains open because too much of the workshop burned, drowned, scattered or turned to dust before we arrived. And so the long shadow before civilization remains where it's always been, just behind the first clear light of the historical world, enormous and mostly unseen, full of vanished landscapes, unrecorded names, drowned shores, forgotten innovations, broken transmissions, and human lives that shape the future without ever knowing how completely they would be hidden. The age before civilization is not a simple beginning. It is the deepest chamber of the human story, and science, for all it has learned, still stands at its entrance listening to echoes. In the end, perhaps the most honest image is a quiet one. Not a city rising, not a monument standing against the sky, not a king naming his victories into stone. Instead, a shoreline that no longer exists, a fire burning low on ground now far beneath the sea, footprints crossing wet sediment that hardens, survives for a time, and is then broken open by ages that do not remember the people who made them. A child learning a path through reeds, an elder pointing toward distant water or distant ice, or the dark line of the animals moving across a plain that has no name in any later language. A group carrying with them everything that matters, because everything that matters can still be carried. That may be why the prehistoric world feels so difficult to hold in the mind. It is both our beginning and our missing place. It is the longest part of the story, and the part that speaks most softly. We know now that it was never empty. It was full of movement, skill, fear, patience, invention, hunger, memory, and adaptation on a scale almost too large to picture. It was full of people as real as any who came after, people who read the land closely enough to survive it, who taught one another what could not be forgotten, who endured changes in climate and coastline and prey and distance that would have shattered weaker chains of memory. And still, most of their world is gone. The camps vanish, the tools break, the fibers rot, the voices stop, the coastlines drown. What remains is scattered and precious, a blade edge, a burial, a painted wall hidden in darkness, a trace in DNA, a layer of ash, a drowned river channel seen by instruments from above. Enough to know that the silence is deceptive, not enough to make the silence disappear. Perhaps that is fitting, in a way. The age before civilization was never built for us. It was built for survival in the present tense, for one season leading into the next, for children who had to learn quickly and remember well, for lives lived without any promise of being preserved. And yet those lost people did preserve something. They preserved us. They passed forward the habits of mind, the social intelligence, the endurance, the flexibility, and the deep human instinct to begin again after loss. So the mystery remains, not as a failure, but as a horizon. Behind every written word lies an older spoken one. Behind every wall, an older shelter. Behind every map, an older path. Behind every civilization, a longer human night filled with firelight, memory, and moving feet. And somewhere in that darkness, still beyond full reach, is the first true shape of our story.